Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud, translated by James Strachey, narrated by Stephen Crossley. Copyright 1961 by the Institute of Psychoanalysis, London. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with the Institute of Psychoanalysis and was produced in the year 2011 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. 1. It is impossible to escape the impression that people commonly use false standards of measurement, that they seek power, success, and wealth for themselves and admire them in others, and that they underestimate what is of true value in life. And yet, in making any general judgment of this sort, we are in danger of forgetting how variegated the human world and its mental life are. There are a few men from whom their contemporaries do not withhold admiration, although their greatness rests on attributes and achievements which are completely foreign to the aims and ideals of the multitude. One might easily be inclined to suppose that it is after all only a minority which appreciates these great men, while the large majority cares nothing for them. But things are probably not as simple as that, thanks to the discrepancies between people's thoughts and their actions, and to the diversity of their wishful impulses. One of these exceptional few calls himself my friend in his letters to me. I had sent him my small book that treats religion as an illusion, and he answered that he entirely agreed with my judgment upon religion, but that he was sorry I had not properly appreciated the true source of religious sentiments. This, he says, consists in a peculiar feeling which he himself is never without, which he finds confirmed by many others, and which he may suppose is present in millions of people. It is a feeling which he would like to call a sensation of eternity, a feeling as of something limitless, unbounded, as it were, oceanic. This feeling, he adds, is a purely subjective fact, not an article of faith. It brings with it no assurance of personal immortality, but it is the source of the religious energy which is seized upon by the various churches and religious systems, directed by them into particular channels, and doubtless also exhausted by them. One may, he thinks, rightly call oneself religious on the ground of this oceanic feeling alone, even if one rejects every belief and every illusion. The views expressed by the friend whom I so much honor, and who himself once praised the magic of illusion in a poem, cause me no small difficulty. I cannot discover this oceanic feeling in myself. It is not easy to deal scientifically with feelings. One can attempt to describe their physiological signs. Where this is not possible, and I am afraid that the oceanic feeling too will defy this kind of characterization, nothing remains but to fall back on the ideational content which is most readily associated with the feeling. If I have understood my friend rightly, he means the same thing by it as the consolation offered by an original and somewhat eccentric dramatist to his hero who is facing a self-inflicted death. We cannot fall out of this world. That is to say, it is a feeling of indissoluble bond, of being one with the external world as a whole. I may remark that to me this seems something rather in the nature of an intellectual perception, which is not, it is true, without an accompanying feeling tone, but only such as would be present with any other act of thought of equal range. From my own experience, I could not convince myself of the primary nature of such a feeling. But this gives me no right to deny that it does in fact occur in other people. The only question is whether it is being correctly interpreted, and whether it ought to be regarded as the fons et origo of the whole need for religion. I have nothing to suggest which could have a decisive influence on the solution of this problem. The idea of men's receiving an intimation of their connection with the world around them through an immediate feeling which is from the outset directed to that purpose sounds so strange and fits in so badly with the fabric of our psychology that one is justified in attempting to discover a psychoanalytic, that is, a genetic explanation of such a feeling. The following line of thought suggests itself. Normally there is nothing of which we are more certain than the feeling of ourself, of our own ego. This ego appears to us as something autonomous and unitary, marked off distinctly from everything else. that such an appearance is deceptive, and that on the contrary the ego is continued inwards, without any sharp delimitation into an unconscious mental entity which we designate as the id, and for which it serves as a kind of facade. This was a discovery first made by psychoanalytic research, which should still have much more to tell us about the relation of the ego to the id. But towards the outside, at any rate, the ego seems to maintain clear and sharp lines of demarcation. There is only one state, admittedly an unusual state, but not one that can be stigmatized as pathological, in which it does not do this. At the height of being in love, the boundary between ego and object threatens to melt away. Against all the evidence of his senses, a man who is in love declares that I and you are one, and is prepared to behave as if it were a fact. What can be temporarily done away with by a physiological, i.e. normal function, must also, of course, be liable to be disturbed by pathological processes. Pathology has made us acquainted with a great number of states in which the boundary lines between the ego and the external world become uncertain, or in which they are actually drawn incorrectly. There are cases in which parts of a person's own body, even portions of his own mental life, his perceptions, thoughts, and feelings, appear alien to him and as not belonging to his ego. There are other cases in which he ascribes to the external world things that clearly originate in his own ego, and that ought to be acknowledged by it. Thus even the feeling of our own ego is subject to disturbances, and the boundaries of the ego are not constant. Further reflection tells us that the adult's ego feeling cannot have been the same from the beginning. It must have gone through a process of development, which cannot, of course, be demonstrated, but which admits of being constructed with a fair degree of probability. An infant at the breast does not as yet distinguish his ego from the external world as the source of the sensations flowing in upon him. He gradually learns to do so, in response to various promptings. He must be very strongly impressed by the fact that some sources of excitation, which he will later recognize as his own bodily organs, can provide him with sensations at any moment, whereas other sources evade him from time to time. Among them what he desires most of all, his mother's breast, and only reappear as a result of his screaming for help. In this way there is, for the first time, set over against the ego an object, in the form of something which exists outside, and which is only forced to appear by a special action. A further incentive to a disengagement of the ego from the general mass of sensations, that is, to the recognition of an outside, an external world, is provided by the frequent, manifold, and unavoidable sensations of pain and unpleasure, the removal and avoidance of which is enjoined by the pleasure principle in the exercise of its unrestricted domination. A tendency arises to separate from the ego everything that can become a source of such unpleasure, to throw it outside, and to create a pure pleasure ego, which is confronted by a strange and threatening outside. The boundaries of this primitive pleasure ego cannot escape rectification through experience. Some of the things that one is unwilling to give up because they give pleasure are nevertheless not ego, but object. And some sufferings that one seeks to expel turn out to be inseparable from the ego in virtue of their internal origin. One comes to learn a procedure by which, through a deliberate direction of one's sensory activities and through suitable muscular action, one can differentiate between what is internal, what belongs to the ego, and what is external, what emanates from the outer world. In this way one makes the first step towards the introduction of the reality principle, which is to dominate future development. This differentiation, of course, serves the practical purpose of enabling one to defend oneself against sensations of unpleasure which one actually feels or with which one is threatened. In order to fend off certain unpleasurable excitations arising from within, the ego can use no other methods than those which it uses against unpleasure coming from without. And this is the starting point of important pathological disturbances. In this way, then, the ego detaches itself from the external world. Or, to put it more correctly, originally the ego includes everything. Later, it separates off an external world from itself. Our present ego feeling is therefore only a shrunken residue of a much more inclusive, indeed an all-embracing feeling which corresponded to a more intimate bond between the ego and the world about it. If we may assume that there are many people in whose mental life this primary ego feeling has persisted to a greater or less degree, it would exist in them side by side with the narrower and more sharply demarcated ego feeling of maturity, like a kind of counterpart to it. In that case, the ideational contents appropriate to it would be precisely those of limitlessness and of a bond with the universe, the same ideas with which my friend elucidated the oceanic feeling. But have we a right to assume the survival of something that was originally there, alongside of what was later derived from it? Undoubtedly. There is nothing strange in such a phenomenon, whether in the mental field or elsewhere. In the animal kingdom, we hold to the view that the most highly developed species have proceeded from the lowest, and yet we find all the simple forms still in existence today. The race of the great saurians is extinct and has made way for the mammals, but a true representative of it, the crocodile, still lives among us. This analogy may be too remote, and it is also weakened by the circumstance that the lower species which survive are, for the most part, not the true ancestors of the present-day, more highly developed species. As a rule, the intermediate links have died out and are known to us only through reconstruction. In the realm of the mind, on the other hand, what is primitive is so commonly preserved alongside of the transformed version which has arisen from it, that it is unnecessary to give instances as evidence. When this happens, it is usually in consequence of a divergence in development. One portion, in the quantitative sense of an attitude or instinctual impulse, has remained unaltered, while another portion has undergone further development. This brings us to the more general problem of preservation in the sphere of the mind. The subject has hardly been studied as yet, but it is so attractive and important that we may be allowed to turn our attention to it for a little, even though our excuse is insufficient. Since we overcame the error of supposing that the forgetting we are familiar with signified a destruction of the memory trace, that is, its annihilation, we have been inclined to take the opposite view, that in mental life nothing which has once been formed can perish, that everything is somehow preserved, and that in suitable circumstances, when, for instance, regression goes back far enough, it can once more be brought to light. Let us try to grasp what this assumption involves by taking an analogy from another field. We will choose as an example the history of the eternal city. Historians tell us that the oldest Rome was the Roma Quadrata, a fenced settlement on the Palatine. Then followed the phase of the Septimontium, a federation of the settlements on the different hills. After that came the city bounded by the Servian Wall, and later still, after all the transformations during the periods of the Republic and the early Caesars, the city which the Emperor Aurelian surrounded with his walls. We will not follow the changes which the city went through any further, but we will ask ourselves how much a visitor, whom we will suppose to be equipped with the most complete historical and topographical knowledge, may still find left of these early stages in the Rome of today. Except for a few gaps, he will see the wall of Aurelian almost unchanged. In some places he will be able to find sections of the Servian wall where they have been excavated and brought to light. If he knows enough, more than present-day archaeology does, he may perhaps be able to trace out in the plan of the city the whole course of that wall and the outline of the Roma Quadrata. Of the buildings which once occupied this ancient area he will find nothing, or only scanty remains, for they exist no longer. The best information about Rome in the Republican era would only enable him at the most to point out the sites where the temples and public buildings of that period stood. Their place is now taken by ruins, but not by ruins of themselves, but of later restorations made after fires or destruction. It is hardly necessary to remark that all these remains of ancient Rome are found dovetailed into the jumble of a great metropolis which has grown up in the last few centuries since the Renaissance. There is certainly not a little that is ancient still buried in the soil of the city or beneath its modern buildings. This is the manner in which the past is preserved in historical sites like Rome. Now let us, by a flight of imagination, suppose that Rome is not a human habitation, but a psychical entity with a similarly long and copious past. An entity, that is to say, in which nothing that has once come into existence will have passed away, and all the earlier phases of development continue to exist alongside the latest one. This would mean that in Rome the palaces of the Caesars and the Septizonium of Septimius Severus would still be rising to their old height on the Palatine, and that the castle of St. Angelo would still be carrying on its battlements the beautiful statues which graced it until the siege by the Goths and so on. But more than this, in the place occupied by the Palazzo Caffarelli would once more stand, without the palazzo having to be removed, the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. And this not only in its latest shape as the Romans of the Empire saw it, but also in its earliest one when it still showed Etruscan forms and was ornamented with terracotta antefixes. Where the Colosseum now stands, we could at the same time admire Nero's vanished golden house. On the piazza of the Pantheon, we should find not only the Pantheon of today, as it was bequeathed to us by Hadrian, but on the same site the original edifice erected by Agrippa. Indeed, the same piece of ground would be supporting the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, and the ancient temple over which it was built. And the observer would perhaps only have to change the direction of his glance or his position in order to call up the one view or the other. There is clearly no point in spinning our fantasy any further, for it leads to things that are unimaginable and even absurd. If we want to represent historical sequence in spatial terms, we can only do it by juxtaposition in space. The same space cannot have two different contents. Our attempt seems to be an idle game. It has only one justification. It shows us how far we are from mastering the characteristics of mental life by representing them in pictorial terms. There is one further objection which has to be considered. The question may be raised why we chose precisely the past of a city to compare with the past of the mind. The assumption that everything past is preserved holds good even in mental life only on condition that the organ of the mind has remained intact, and that its tissues have not been damaged by trauma or inflammation. But destructive influences which can be compared to causes of illness like these are never lacking in the history of a city, even if it has had a less checkered past than Rome, and even if, like London, it has hardly ever suffered from the visitations of an enemy. Demolitions and replacement of buildings occur in the course of the most peaceful development of a city. A city is thus a priori unsuited for a comparison of this sort with a mental organism. We bow to this objection, and, abandoning our attempt to draw a striking contrast, we will turn instead to what is after all a more closely related object of comparison, the body of an animal or a human being. But here too we find the same thing. The earlier phases of development are in no sense still preserved. They have been absorbed into the later phases for which they have supplied the material. The embryo cannot be discovered in the adult. The thymus gland of childhood is replaced after puberty by connective tissue, but is no longer present itself. In the marrow bones of the grown man I can, it is true, trace the outline of the child's bone, but it itself has disappeared, having lengthened and thickened until it has attained its definitive form. The fact remains that only in the mind is such a preservation of all the earlier stages alongside of the final form possible, and that we are not in a position to represent this phenomenon in pictorial terms. Perhaps we are going too far in this. Perhaps we ought to content ourselves with asserting that what is past in mental life may be preserved and is not necessarily destroyed. It is always possible that even in the mind some of what is old is effaced or absorbed, whether in the normal course of things or as an exception, to such an extent that it cannot be restored or revivified by any means, or that preservation in general is dependent on certain favourable conditions. It is possible, but we know nothing about it. We can only hold fast to the fact that it is rather the rule than the exception for the past to be preserved in mental life. Thus, we are perfectly willing to acknowledge that the oceanic feeling exists in many people, and we are inclined to trace it back to an early phase of ego feeling. The further question then arises, what claim this feeling has to be regarded as the source of religious needs. To me, the claim does not seem compelling. After all, a feeling can only be a source of energy if it is itself the expression of a strong need. The derivation of religious needs from the infant's helplessness and the longing for the father aroused by it seems to me incontrovertible, especially since the feeling is not simply prolonged from childhood days, but is permanently sustained by fear of the superior power of fate. I cannot think of any need in childhood as strong as the need for a father's protection. Thus the part played by the oceanic feeling, which might seek something like the restoration of a limitless narcissism, is ousted from a place in the foreground. The origin of the religious attitude can be traced back in clear outlines as far as the feeling of infantile helplessness. There may be something further behind that, but for the present it is wrapped in obscurity. I can imagine that the oceanic feeling became connected with religion later on. The oneness with the universe, which constitutes its ideational content, sounds like a first attempt at a religious consolation, as though it were another way of disclaiming the danger which the ego recognizes as threatening it from the external world. Let me admit once more that it is very difficult for me to work with these almost intangible quantities. Another friend of mine, whose insatiable craving for knowledge has led him to make the most unusual experiments and has ended by giving him encyclopedic knowledge, has assured me that through the practice of yoga, by withdrawing from the world, by fixing the attention on bodily functions, and by peculiar methods of breathing, one can in fact evoke new sensations and synesthesias in oneself, which he regards as regressions to primordial states of mind which have long ago been overlaid. He sees in them a physiological basis, as it were, of much of the wisdom of mysticism. It would not be hard to find connections here with a number of obscure modifications of mental life, such as trances and ecstasies. But I am moved to exclaim, in the words of Schiller's diver, Es freut sich, veratmet im rosigten Licht. Let him rejoice who breathes up here in the roseate light. 2. In my Future of an Illusion, 1927, I was concerned much less with the deepest sources of the religious feeling than with what the common man understands by his religion, with the system of doctrines and promises which on the one hand explains to him the riddles of this world with enviable completeness, and on the other assures him that a careful providence will watch over his life and will compensate him in a future existence for any frustrations he suffers here. The common man cannot imagine this providence otherwise than in the figure of an enormously exalted Father. Only such a being can understand the needs of the children of men and be softened by their prayers and placated by the signs of their remorse. The whole thing is so patently infantile, so foreign to reality, that anyone with a friendly attitude to humanity, it is painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise above this view of life. It is still more humiliating to discover how large a number of people living today, who cannot but see that this religion is not tenable, nevertheless try to defend it piece by piece in a series of pitiful rearguard actions. One would like to mix among the ranks of the believers in order to meet these philosophers, who think they can rescue the God of religion by replacing him by an impersonal, shadowy and abstract principle, and to address them with the warning words, "Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain." And if some of the great men of the past acted in the same way, no appeal can be made to their example. We know why they were obliged to. Let us return to the common man and to his religion, the only religion which ought to bear that name. The first thing that we think of is the well-known saying of one of our great poets and thinkers concerning the relation of religion to art and science. Wer Wissenschaft und Kunst besitzt, hat auch Religion. Für jener beide nicht besitzt der Hab Religion. He who possesses science and art also has religion, but he who possesses neither of those two, let him have religion. This saying, on the one hand, draws an antithesis between religion and the two highest achievements of man, and on the other, asserts that, as regards their value in life, those achievements and religion can represent or replace each other. If we also set out to deprive the common man, who has neither science nor art, of his religion, we shall clearly not have the poet's authority on our side. We will choose a particular path to bring us nearer an appreciation of his words. Life, as we find it, is too hard for us. It brings us too many pains, disappointments, and impossible tasks. In order to bear it, we cannot dispense with palliative measures. We cannot do without auxiliary constructions, as Theodor Fontana tells us. There are perhaps 3 such measures: powerful deflections which cause us to make light of our misery, substitutive satisfactions which diminish it, and intoxicating substances which make us insensitive to it. Something of the kind is indispensable. Voltaire has deflections in mind when he ends Candide with the advice to cultivate one's garden, and scientific activity is a deflection of this kind too. The substitutive satisfactions, as offered by art, are illusions in contrast with reality, but they are nonetheless psychically effective, thanks to the role which fantasy has assumed in mental life. The intoxicating substances influence our body and alter its chemistry. It is no simple matter to see where religion has its place in this series. We must look further afield. The question of the purpose of human life has been raised countless times. It has never yet received a satisfactory answer, and perhaps does not admit of one. Some of those who have asked it have added that if it should turn out that life has no purpose, it would lose all value for them. But this threat alters nothing. It looks on the contrary as though one had a right to dismiss the question, for it seems to derive from the human presumptuousness, many other manifestations of which are already familiar to us. Nobody talks about the purpose of the life of animals, unless, perhaps, it may be supposed to lie in being of service to man. But this view is not tenable either, for there are many animals of which man can make nothing, except to describe, classify, and study them. And innumerable species of animals have escaped even this use, since they existed and became extinct before man set eyes on them. Once again, only religion can answer the question of the purpose of life. One can hardly be wrong in concluding that the idea of life having a purpose stands and falls with the religious system. We will therefore turn to the less ambitious question of what men themselves show by their behavior to be the purpose and intention of their lives. What do they demand of life, and wish to achieve in it? The answer to this can hardly be in doubt. They strive after happiness. They want to become happy and to remain so. This endeavour has 2 sides, a positive and a negative aim. It aims on the one hand at an absence of pain and unpleasure, and, on the other, at the experiencing of strong feelings of pleasure. In its narrower sense, the word happiness only relates to the last. In conformity with this dichotomy in his aims, man's activity develops in 2 directions, according as it seeks to realize, in the main or even exclusively, the one or the other of these aims. As we see, what decides the purpose of life is simply the program of the pleasure principle. This principle dominates the operation of the mental apparatus from the start. There can be no doubt about its efficacy, and yet its program is at loggerheads with the whole world, with the macrocosm as much as with the microcosm. There is no possibility at all of its being carried through. All the regulations of the universe run counter to it. One feels inclined to say that the intention that man should be happy is not included in the plan of creation. What we call happiness in the strictest sense comes from the, preferably sudden, satisfaction of needs which have been dammed up to a high degree, and it is from its nature only possible as an episodic phenomenon. When any situation that is desired by the pleasure principle is prolonged, it only produces a feeling of mild contentment. We are so made that we can derive intense enjoyment only from a contrast and very little from a state of things. Thus our possibilities of happiness are already restricted by our constitution. Unhappiness is much less difficult to experience. We are threatened with suffering from three directions: from our own body, which is doomed to decay and dissolution, and which cannot even do without pain and anxiety as warning signals; from the external world, which may rage against us with overwhelming and merciless forces of destruction; and finally, from our relations to other men. The suffering which comes from this last source is perhaps more painful to us than any other. We tend to regard it as a kind of gratuitous addition, although it cannot be any less fatefully inevitable than the suffering which comes from elsewhere. It is no wonder if, under the pressure of these possibilities of suffering, men are accustomed to moderate their claims to happiness, just as the pleasure principle itself, indeed under the influence of the external world, changed into the more modest reality principle. If a man thinks himself happy merely to have escaped unhappiness or to have survived his suffering, and if in general the task of avoiding suffering pushes that of obtaining pleasure into the background, reflection shows that the accomplishment of this task can be attempted along very different paths, and all these paths have been recommended by the various schools of worldly wisdom and put into practice by men. An unrestricted satisfaction of every need presents itself as the most enticing method of conducting one's life, but it means putting enjoyment before caution, and soon brings its own punishment. The other methods, in which avoidance of unpleasure is the main purpose, are differentiated according to the source of unpleasure to which their attention is chiefly turned. Some of these methods are extreme and some moderate. Some are one-sided, and some attack the problem simultaneously at several points. Against the suffering which may come upon one from human relationships, the readiest safeguard is voluntary isolation, keeping oneself aloof from other people. The happiness which can be achieved along this path is, as we see, the happiness of quietness. Against the dreaded external world, one can only defend oneself by some kind of turning away from it, if one intends to solve the task by oneself. There is indeed another and better path, that of becoming a member of the human community, and with the help of a technique guided by science, going over to the attack against nature and subjecting her to the human will. Then one is working with all for the good of all. But the most interesting methods of averting suffering are those which seek to influence our own organism. In the last analysis, all suffering is nothing else than sensation. It only exists insofar as we feel it, and we only feel it in consequence of certain ways in which our organism is regulated. The crudest, but also the most effective among these methods of influence, is the chemical one: intoxication. I do not think that anyone completely understands its mechanism, but it is a fact that there are foreign substances which, when present in the blood or tissues, directly causes pleasurable sensations. And they also so alter the conditions governing our sensibility that we become incapable of receiving unpleasurable impulses. The two effects not only occur simultaneously, but seem to be intimately bound up with each other. But there must be substances in the chemistry of our own bodies which have similar effects. For we know at least one pathological state, mania, in which a condition similar to intoxication arises without the administration of any intoxicating drug. Besides this, our normal mental life exhibits oscillations between a comparatively easy liberation of pleasure and a comparatively difficult one, parallel with which there goes a diminished or an increased receptivity to unpleasure. It is greatly to be regretted that this toxic side of mental processes has so far escaped scientific examination. The service rendered by intoxicating media in the struggle for happiness and in keeping misery at a distance is so highly prized as a benefit that individuals and peoples alike have given them an established place in the economics of their libido. We owe to such media not merely the immediate yield of pleasure, but also a greatly desired degree of independence from the external world. For one knows that with the help of this drowner of cares, one can at any time withdraw from the pressure of reality and find refuge in a world of one's own, with better conditions of sensibility. As is well known, it is precisely this property of intoxicants which also determines their danger and their injuriousness. They are responsible in certain circumstances for the useless waste of a large quota of energy which might have been employed for the improvement of the human lot. The complicated structure of our mental apparatus admits, however, of a whole number of other influences. Just as a satisfaction of instinct spells happiness for us, so severe suffering is caused as if the external world lets us starve, if it refuses to sate our needs. One may therefore hope to be freed from a part of one's sufferings by influencing the instinctual impulses. This type of defense against suffering is no longer brought to bear on the sensory apparatus. It seeks to master the internal sources of our needs. The extreme form of this is brought about by killing off the instincts, as is prescribed by the worldly wisdom of the East and practiced by yoga. If it succeeds, then the subject has, it is true, given up all other activities as well. He has sacrificed his life. And by another path, he has once more only achieved the happiness of quietness. We follow the same path when our aims are less extreme and we merely attempt to control our instinctual life. In that case, the controlling elements are the higher psychical agencies which have subjected themselves to the reality principle. Here the aim of satisfaction is not by any means relinquished. But a certain amount of protection against suffering is secured, in that non-satisfaction is not so painfully felt in the case of instincts kept in dependence as in the case of uninhibited ones. As against this, there is an undeniable diminution in the potentialities of enjoyment. The feeling of happiness derived from the satisfaction of a wild instinctual impulse untamed by the ego is incomparably more intense than that derived from sating an instinct that has been tamed. The irresistibility of perverse instincts and perhaps the attraction in general of forbidden things finds an economic explanation here. Another technique for fending off suffering is the employment of the displacements of libido which our mental apparatus permits of and through which its function gains so much inflexibility. The task here is that of shifting the instinctual aims in such a way that they cannot come up against frustration from the external world. In this, sublimation of the instincts lends its assistance. One gains the most if one can sufficiently heighten the yield of pleasure from the sources of psychical and intellectual work. When that is so, fate can do little against one. A satisfaction of this kind, such as an artist's joy in creating, in giving his fantasies body, or a scientist's in solving problems or discovering truths, has a special quality which we shall certainly one day be able to characterize in metapsychological terms. At present, we can only say figuratively that such satisfactions seem finer and higher. But their intensity is mild as compared with that derived from the sating of crude and primary instinctual impulses. It does not convulse our physical being. And the weak point of this method is that it is not applicable generally. It is accessible to only a few people. It presupposes the possession of special dispositions and gifts which are far from being common to any practical degree. And even to the few who do possess them, this method cannot give complete protection from suffering. It creates no impenetrable armor against the arrows of fortune, and it habitually fails when the source of suffering is a person's own body. While this procedure already clearly shows an intention of making oneself independent of the external world by seeking satisfaction in internal psychical processes, the next procedure brings out those features yet more strongly. In it, the connection with reality is still further loosened. Satisfaction is obtained from illusions, which are recognized as such without the discrepancy between them and reality being allowed to interfere with enjoyment. The region from which these illusions arise is the life of the imagination. At the time when the development of the sense of reality took place, this region was expressly exempted from the demands of reality testing and was set apart for the purpose of fulfilling wishes which were difficult to carry out. At the head of these satisfactions, through fantasy, stands the enjoyment of works of art, an enjoyment which, by the agency of the artist, is made accessible even to those who are not themselves creative. People who are receptive to the influence of art cannot set too high a value on it as a source of pleasure and consolation in life. Nevertheless, the mild narcosis induced in us by art can do no more than bring about a transient withdrawal from the pressure of vital needs, and it is not strong enough to make us forget real misery. Another procedure operates more energetically and more thoroughly. It regards reality as the sole enemy and as the source of all suffering with which it is impossible to live, so that one must break off all relations with it if one is to be in any way happy. The hermit turns his back on the world and will have no truck with it. But one can do more than that. One can try to recreate the world, to build up in its stead another world in which its most unbearable features are eliminated and replaced by others that are in conformity with one's own wishes. But whoever, in desperate defiance, sets out upon this path to happiness will, as a rule, attain nothing. Reality is too strong for him. He becomes a madman, who, for the most part, finds no one to help him in carrying through his delusion. It is asserted, however, that each one of us behaves in some one respect like a paranoiac, corrects some aspect of the world which is unbearable to him by the construction of a wish, and introduces this delusion into reality. A special importance attaches to the case in which this attempt to procure a certainty of happiness and a protection against suffering through a delusional remoulding of reality is made by a considerable number of people in common. The religions of mankind must be classed among the mass delusions of this kind. No one, needless to say, who shares a delusion ever recognizes it as such. I do not think that I have made a complete enumeration of the methods by which men strive to gain happiness and keep suffering away, and I know too that the material might have been differently arranged. One procedure I have not yet mentioned, not because I have forgotten it, but because it will concern us later in another connection. And how could one possibly forget of all others this technique in the art of living? It is conspicuous for a most remarkable combination of characteristic features. It, too, aims, of course, at making the subject independent of fate, as it is best to call it, and to that end it locates satisfaction in internal mental processes, making use, in so doing, of the displaceability of the libido of which we have already spoken. But it does not turn away from the external world. On the contrary, it clings to the objects belonging to that world and obtains happiness from an emotional relationship to them. Nor is it content to aim at an avoidance of unpleasure, a goal, as we might call it, of weary resignation. It passes this by without heed and holds fast to the original, passionate striving for a positive fulfillment of happiness. And perhaps it does, in fact, come nearer to this goal than any other method. I am, of course, speaking of the way of life which makes love the centre of everything, which looks for all satisfaction in loving and being loved. A psychical attitude of this sort comes naturally enough to all of us. One of the forms in which love manifests itself, sexual love, has given us our most intense experience of an overwhelming sensation of pleasure and has thus furnished us with a pattern for our search for happiness. What is more natural than that we should persist in looking for happiness along the path on which we first encountered it? The weak side of this technique of living is easy to see. Otherwise, no human being would have thought of abandoning this path to happiness for any other. It is that we are never so defenseless against suffering as when we love, never so helplessly unhappy as when we have lost our loved object or its love. But this does not dispose of the technique of living based on the value of love as a means to happiness. There is much more to be said about it. We may go on from here to consider the interesting cast in which happiness in life is predominantly sought in the enjoyment of beauty, wherever beauty presents itself to our senses and our judgment, the beauty of human forms and gestures, of natural objects and landscapes, and of artistic and even scientific creations. This aesthetic attitude to the goal of life offers little protection against the threat of suffering, but it can compensate for a great deal. The enjoyment of beauty has a peculiar, mildly intoxicating quality of feeling. Beauty has no obvious use, nor is there any clear cultural necessity for it. Yet civilization could not do without it. The science of aesthetics investigates the conditions under which things are felt as beautiful, but it has been unable to give any explanation of the nature and origin of beauty. And, as usually happens, lack of success is concealed beneath a flood of resounding and empty words. Psychoanalysis, unfortunately, has scarcely anything to say about beauty either. All that seems certain is its derivation from the field of sexual feeling. The love of beauty seems a perfect example of an impulse inhibited in its aim. Beauty and attraction are originally attributes of the sexual object. It is worth remarking that the genitals themselves, the sight of which is always exciting, are nevertheless hardly ever judged to be beautiful. The quality of beauty seems instead to attach to certain secondary sexual characters. In spite of the incompleteness of my enumeration, I will venture on a few remarks as a conclusion to our inquiry. The program of becoming happy which the pleasure principle imposes on us cannot be fulfilled. Yet we must not, indeed we cannot, give up our efforts to bring it nearer to fulfillment by some means or other. Very different paths may be taken in that direction, and we may give priority either to the positive aspect of the aim, that of gaining pleasure, or to its negative one, that of avoiding unpleasure. By none of these paths can we attain all that we desire. Happiness, in the reduced sense in which we recognize it as possible, is a problem of the economics of the individual's libido. There is no golden rule which applies to everyone. Every man must find out for himself in what particular fashion he can be saved. All kinds of different factors will operate to direct his choice. It is a question of how much real satisfaction he can expect to get from the external world, how far he is led to make himself independent of it, and finally, how much strength he feels he has for altering the world to suit his wishes. In this, his psychical constitution will play a decisive part, irrespectively of the external circumstances. The man who is predominantly erotic will give first preference to his emotional relationships to other people. The narcissistic man, who inclines to be self-sufficient, will seek his main satisfactions in his internal mental processes. The man of action will never give up the external world on which he can try out his strength. As regards the second of these types, the nature of his talents and the amount of instinctual sublimation open to him will decide where he shall locate his interests. Any choice that is pushed to an extreme will be penalized by exposing the individual to the dangers which arise if a technique of living that has been chosen as an exclusive one should prove inadequate. Just as a cautious businessman avoids tying up all his capital in one concern, so perhaps worldly wisdom will advise us not to look for the whole of our satisfaction from a single aspiration. Its success is never certain, for that depends on the convergence of many factors, perhaps on none more than on the capacity of the psychical constitution to adapt its function to the environment and then to exploit that environment for a yield of pleasure. A person who is born with a specially unfavorable instinctual constitution and who has not properly undergone the transformation and rearrangements of his libidinal components, which is indispensable for later achievements, will find it hard to obtain happiness from his external situation, especially if he is faced with tasks of some difficulty. As a last technique of living which will at least bring him substitutive satisfactions, he is offered that of a flight into neurotic illness, a flight which he usually accomplishes when he is still young. The man who sees his pursuit of happiness come to nothing in later years can still find consolation in the yield of pleasure of chronic intoxication. Or he can embark on the desperate attempt at rebellion seen in a psychosis. Religion restricts this play of choice and adaptation, since it imposes equally on everyone its own path to the acquisition of happiness and protection from suffering. Its technique consists in depressing the value of life and distorting the picture of the real world in a delusional manner, which presupposes an intimidation of the intelligence. At this price, by forcibly fixing them in a state of psychical infantilism and by drawing them into a mass delusion, religion succeeds in sparing many people an individual neurosis, but hardly anything more. There are, as we have said, many paths which may lead to such happiness as is attainable by men, but there is none which does so for certain. Even religion cannot keep its promise. If the believer finally sees himself obliged to speak of God's inscrutable decrees, he is admitting that all that is left to him as a last possible consolation and source of pleasure in his suffering is an unconditional submission. And if he is prepared for that, he could probably have spared himself the detour he has made. 3. Our inquiry concerning happiness has not so far taught us much that is not already common knowledge. And even if we proceed from it to the problem of why it is so hard for men to be happy, there seems no greater prospect of learning anything new. We have given the answer already by pointing to the three sources from which our suffering comes: the superior power of nature, the feebleness of our own bodies, and the inadequacy of the regulations which adjust the mutual relationships of human beings in the family, the state, and society. In regard to the first two sources, our judgment cannot hesitate long. It forces us to acknowledge those sources of suffering and to submit to the inevitable. We shall never completely master nature, and our bodily organism, itself a part of that nature, will always remain a transient structure with a limited capacity for adaptation and achievement. This recognition does not have a paralyzing effect. On the contrary, it points the direction for our activity. If we cannot remove all suffering, we can remove some, and we can mitigate some. The experience of many thousands of years has convinced us of that. As regards the third source, the social source of suffering, our attitude is a different one. We do not admit it at all. We cannot see why the regulations made by ourselves should not, on the contrary, be a protection and a benefit for every one of us. And yet, when we consider how unsuccessful we have been in precisely this field of prevention of suffering, a suspicion dawns on us that here, too, a piece of unconquerable nature may lie behind. This time, a piece of our own psychical constitution. When we start considering this possibility, we come upon a contention which is so astonishing that we must dwell upon it. This contention holds that what we call our civilization is largely responsible for our misery, and that we should be much happier if we gave it up and returned to primitive conditions. I call this contention astonishing because, in whatever way we may define the concept of civilization, it is a certain fact that all the things with which we seek to protect ourselves against the threats that emanate from the sources of suffering are part of that very civilization. How has it happened that so many people have come to take up this strange attitude of hostility to civilization? I believe that the basis of it was a deep and long-standing satisfaction with the then existing state of civilization, and that on that basis a condemnation of it was built up, occasioned by certain specific historical events. I think I know what the last and the last but one of those occasions were. I am not learned enough to trace the chain of them far back enough in the history of the human species, but a factor of this kind, hostile to civilization, must already have been at work in the victory of Christendom over the heathen religions, for it was very closely related to the low estimation put upon earthly life by the Christian doctrine. The last but one of these occasions was when the progress of voyages of discovery led to contact with primitive peoples and races. In consequence of insufficient observation and a mistaken view of their manners and customs, they appeared to Europeans to be leading a simple, happy life with few wants, a life such as was unattainable by their visits with their superior civilization. Later experience has corrected some of those judgments. In many cases, the observers had wrongly attributed to the absence of complicated cultural demands what was in fact due to the bounty of nature and the ease with which the major human needs were satisfied. The last occasion is especially familiar to us. It arose when people came to know about the mechanism of the neuroses, which threatened to undermine the modicum of happiness enjoyed by civilized men. It was discovered that a person becomes neurotic because he cannot tolerate the amount of frustration which society imposes on him in the service of its cultural ideals. And it was inferred from this that the abolition or reduction of those demands would result in a return to possibilities of happiness. There is also an added factor of disappointment. During the last few generations, mankind has made an extraordinary advance in the natural sciences and in their technical application, and has established his control over nature in a way never before imagined. The single steps of this advance are common knowledge, and it is unnecessary to enumerate them. Men are proud of those achievements, and have a right to be, but they seem to have observed that this newly won power over space and time, this subjugation of the forces of nature, which is the fulfillment of a longing that goes back thousands of years, has not increased the amount of pleasurable satisfaction which they may expect from life, and has not made them feel happier. From the recognition of this fact, we ought to be content to conclude that power over nature is not the only precondition of human happiness, just as it is not the only goal of cultural endeavor. We ought not to infer from it that technical progress is without value for the economics of our happiness. One would like to ask, is there, then, no positive gain in pleasure, no unequivocal increase in my feeling of happiness if I can, as often as I please, hear the voice of a child of mine who is living hundreds of miles away? Or, if I can learn in the shortest possible time after a friend has reached his destination that he has come through the long and difficult voyage unharmed? Does it mean nothing that medicine has succeeded in enormously reducing infant mortality and the danger of infection for women in childbirth, and, indeed, in considerably lengthening the average life of a civilized man? And there is a long list that might be added to benefits of this kind, which we owe to the much despised era of scientific and technical advances. But here the voice of pessimistic criticism makes itself heard, and warns us that most of these satisfactions follow the model of the cheap enjoyment extolled in the anecdote, the enjoyment obtained by putting a bare leg from under the bedclothes on a cold winter night and drawing it in again. If there had been no railway to conquer distances, my child would never have left his native town, and I should need no telephone to hear his voice. If travelling across the ocean by ship had not been introduced, my friend would not have embarked on his sea voyage, and I should not need a cable to relieve my anxiety about him. What is the use of reducing infantile mortality when it is precisely that reduction which imposes the greatest restraint on us in the begetting of children, so that, taken all round, we nevertheless rear no more children than in the days before the reign of hygiene, while at the same time we have created difficult conditions for our sexual life in marriage, and have probably worked against the beneficial effects of natural selection? And finally, what good to us is a long life if it is difficult and barren of joys, and if it is so full of misery that we can only welcome death as a deliverer? It seems certain that we do not feel comfortable in our present-day civilization, but it is very difficult to form an opinion whether and in what degree men of an earlier age felt happier and what part their cultural conditions played in the matter. We shall always tend to consider people's distress objectively, that is, to place ourselves with our own wants and sensibilities in their conditions, and then to examine what occasions we should find in them for experiencing happiness or unhappiness. This method of looking at things, which seems objective because it ignores the variations in subjective sensibility, is, of course, the most subjective possible, since it puts one's own mental states in the place of any others, unknown though they may be. Happiness, however, is something essentially subjective. No matter how much we may shrink with horror from certain situations, of a galley slave in antiquity, of a peasant during the 30 Years' War, of a victim of the Holy Inquisition, of a Jew awaiting a pogrom, it is nevertheless impossible for us to feel our way into such people. to divine the changes which original obtuseness of mind, a gradual stupefying process, the cessation of expectations, and cruder or more refined methods of narcotization have produced upon their receptivity to sensations of pleasure and unpleasure. Moreover, in the case of the most extreme possibility of suffering, special mental protective devices are brought into operation. It seems to me unprofitable to pursue this aspect of the problem any further. It is time for us to turn our attention to the nature of this civilization on whose value as a means to happiness doubts have been thrown. We shall not look for a formula in which to express that nature in a few words until we have learned something by examining it. We shall therefore content ourselves with saying once more that the word civilization describes the whole sum of the achievements and the regulations which distinguish our lives from those of our animal ancestors, and which serve two purposes, namely to protect men against nature and to adjust their mutual relations. In order to learn more, we will bring together the various features of civilization individually, as they are exhibited in human communities. In doing so, we shall have no hesitation in letting ourselves be guided by linguistic usage, or, as it is also called, linguistic feeling, in the conviction that we shall thus be doing justice to inner discernments which still defy expression in abstract terms. The first stage is easy. We recognize as cultural all activities and resources which are useful to men for making the earth serviceable to them, for protecting them against the violence of the forces of nature, and so on. As regards this side of civilization, there can be scarcely any doubt. If we go back far enough, we find that the first act of civilization were the use of tools, the gaining of control over fire, and the construction of dwellings. Among these, the control over fire stands out as a quite extraordinary and unexampled achievement, while the others opened up paths which man has followed ever since, and the stimulus to which is easily guessed. With every tool, man is perfecting his own organs, whether motor or sensory, or is removing the limits to their functioning. Motor power places gigantic forces at his disposal, which, like his muscles, he can employ in any direction. Thanks to ships and aircraft, neither water nor air can hinder his movements. By means of spectacles, he corrects defects in the lens of his own eye. By means of the telescope, he sees into the far distance. And by means of the microscope, he overcomes the limits of visibility set by the structure of his retina. In the photographic camera, he has created an instrument which retains the fleeting visual impressions just as a gramophone disc retains the equally fleeting auditory ones. Both are, at bottom, materializations of the power he possesses of recollection, his memory. With the help of the telephone, he can hear at distances which would be respected as unattainable even in a fairy tale. Writing was in its origin the voice of an absent person, and the dwelling house was a substitute for the mother's womb, the first lodging, for which, in all likelihood, man still longs, and in which he was safe and felt at ease. These things that by his science and technology man has brought about on this earth, on which he first appeared as a feeble animal organism, and on which each individual of his species must once more make its entry, O inch of nature, as a helpless suckling. These things do not only sound like a fairy tale, they are an actual fulfillment of every, or of almost every, fairy tale wish. All these assets he may lay claim to as his cultural acquisition. Long ago he formed an ideal conception of omnipotence and omniscience which he embodied in his gods. To these gods he attributed everything that seemed unattainable to his wishes or that was forbidden to him. One may say, therefore, that these gods were cultural ideals. Today he has come very close to the attainment of this ideal. He has almost become a god himself. Only, it is true, in the fashion in which ideals are usually attained according to the general judgment of humanity. Not completely. In some respects not at all, in others only halfway. Man has, as it were, become a kind of prosthetic god. When he puts on all his auxiliary organs, he is truly magnificent. But those organs have not grown on to him, and they still give him much trouble at times. Nevertheless, he is entitled to console himself with the thought that this development will not come to an end precisely with the year 1930 A.D. Future ages will bring with them new and probably unimaginably great advances in this field of civilization, and will increase man's likeness to God still more. But in the interests of our investigations, we will not forget that present-day man does not feel happy in his godlike character. We recognize, then, that countries have attained a high level of civilization if we find that in them everything which can assist in the exploitation of the earth by man and in his protection against the forces of nature, everything, in short, which is of use to him, is attended to and effectively carried out. In such countries, rivers which threaten to flood the land are regulated in their flow, and their water is directed through canals to places where there is a shortage of it. The soil is carefully cultivated and planted with the vegetation which it is suited to support, and the mineral wealth below ground is assiduously brought to the surface and fashioned into the required implements and utensils. The means of communication are ample, rapid, and reliable. Wild and dangerous animals have been exterminated, and the breeding of domesticated animals flourishes. But we demand other things from civilization besides these, and it is a noticeable fact that we hope to find them realized in these same countries. As though we were seeking to repudiate the first demand we made, we welcome it as a sign of civilization as well if we see people directing their care to what has no practical value whatever, to what is useless. If, for instance, the green spaces necessary in a town as playgrounds and as reservoirs of fresh air are also laid out with flower beds, or if the windows of the houses are decorated with pots of flowers, we soon observe that this useless thing which we expect civilization to value is beauty. We require civilized man to reverence beauty wherever he sees it in nature, and to create it in the objects of his handiwork so far as he is able. But this is far from exhausting our demands on civilization. We expect besides to see the signs of cleanliness and order. We do not think highly of the cultural level of an English country town in Shakespeare's time when we read that there was a big dung heap in front of his father's house in Stratford. We are indignant and call it barbarous, which is the opposite of civilized, when we find the paths in the Wienerwald littered with paper. Dirtiness of any kind seems to us incompatible with civilization. We extend our demand for cleanliness to the human body too. We are astonished to learn of the objectionable smell which emanated from the Roi Soleil, and we shake our heads on the Isola Bella when we are shown the tiny wash-basin in which Napoleon made his morning toilet. Indeed, we are not surprised by the idea of setting up the use of soap as an actual yardstick of civilization. The same is true of order. It, like cleanliness, applies solely to the works of man. But whereas cleanliness is not expected in nature, order, on the contrary, has been imitated from her. Man's observation of the great astronomical regularities not only furnished him with a model for introducing order into his life, but gave him the first points of departure for doing so. Order is a kind of compulsion to repeat which, when a regulation has been laid down once and for all, decides when, where, and how a thing shall be done, so that in every similar circumstance one is spared hesitation and indecision. The benefits of order are incontestable. It enables men to use space and time to the best advantage, while conserving their psychical forces. We should have a right to expect that order would have taken its place in human activities from the start and without difficulty. And we may well wonder that this has not happened, that, on the contrary, human beings exhibit an inborn tendency to carelessness, irregularity, and unreliability in their work, and that a laborious training is needed before they learn to follow the example of their celestial models. Beauty, cleanliness, and order obviously occupy a special position among the requirements of civilization. No one will maintain that they are as important for life as control over the forces of nature or as some other factors with which we shall become acquainted. And yet no one would care to put them in the background as trivialities. That civilization is not exclusively taken up with what is useful is already shown by the example of beauty, which we decline to omit from among the interests of civilization. The usefulness of order is quite evident. With regard to cleanliness, we must bear in mind that it is demanded of us by hygiene as well, and we may suspect that even before the days of scientific prophylaxis, the connection between the two was not altogether strange to man. Yet utility does not entirely explain these efforts. Something else must be at work besides. No feature, however, seems better to characterize civilization than its esteem and encouragement of man's higher mental activities, his intellectual, scientific, and artistic achievements, and the leading role that it assigns to ideas in human life. Foremost among those ideas are the religious systems, on whose complicated structure I have endeavored to throw light elsewhere. Next come the speculations of philosophy, and finally what might be called man's ideals, his ideas of a possible perfection of individuals, or of peoples, or of the whole of humanity, and the demands he sets up on the basis of such ideas. The fact that these creations of his are not independent of one another, but are on the contrary closely interwoven, increases the difficulty not only of describing them, but of tracing their psychological derivation. If we assume quite generally that the motive force of all human activities is a striving towards the two confluent goals of utility and a yield of pleasure, we must suppose that this is also true of the manifestations of civilization which we have been discussing here. Although this is easily visible only in scientific and aesthetic activities, but it cannot be doubted that the other activities too correspond to strong needs in men, perhaps to needs which are only developed in a minority. Nor must we allow ourselves to be misled by judgments of value concerning any particular religion or philosophic system or ideal. Whether we think to find in them the highest achievements of the human spirit, or whether we deplore them as aberrations, we cannot but recognize that where they are present, and in especial where they are dominant, a high level of civilization is implied. The last, but certainly not the least important of the characteristic features of civilization remains to be assessed: the manner in which the relationships of men to one another, their social relationships, are regulated. Relationships which affect a person as a neighbor, as a source of help, as another person's sexual object, as a member of a family and of a state. Here it is especially difficult to keep clear of particular ideal demands and to see what is civilized in general. Perhaps we may begin by explaining that the element of civilization enters on the scene with the first attempt to regulate these social relationships. If the attempt were not made, the relationships would be subject to the arbitrary will of the individual. That is to say, the physically stronger man would decide them in the sense of his own interests and instinctual impulses. Nothing would be changed in this if the stronger man should in his turn meet someone even stronger than he. Human life in common is only made possible when a majority comes together which is stronger than any separate individual, and which remains united against all separate individuals. The power of this community is then set up as right in opposition to the power of the individual, which is condemned as brute force. This replacement of the power of the individual by the power of a community constitutes the decisive step of civilization. The essence of it lies in the fact that the members of the community restrict themselves in their possibilities of satisfaction, whereas the individual knew no such restrictions. The first requisite of civilization, therefore, is that of justice. That is, the assurance that a law once made will not be broken in favor of an individual. This implies nothing as to the ethical value of such a law. The further course of cultural development seems to tend towards making the law no longer an expression of the will of a small community, a caste or a stratum of the population, or a racial group, which, in its turn, behaves like a violent individual towards other and perhaps more numerous collections of people. The final outcome should be a rule of law to which all, except those who are not capable of entering a community, have contributed by a sacrifice of their instincts, and which leaves no one, again with the same exception, at the mercy of brute force. The liberty of the individual is no gift of civilization. It was greatest before there was any civilization, though then it is true it had for the most part no value, since the individual was scarcely in a position to defend it. The development of civilization imposes restrictions on it, and justice demands that no one shall escape those restrictions. What makes itself felt in a human community as a desire for freedom may be their revolt against some existing injustice, and so may prove favorable to a further development of civilization. It may remain compatible with civilization, but it may also spring from the remains of their original personality, which is still untamed by civilization, and may thus become the basis in them of hostility to civilization. The urge for freedom, therefore, is directed against particular forms and demands of civilization, or against chanting altogether. It does not seem as though any influence could induce a man to change his nature into a termite's. No doubt he will always defend his claim to individual liberty against the will of the group. A good part of the struggles of mankind centre round the single task of finding an expedient accommodation, one, that is, that will bring happiness, between this claim of the individual and the cultural claims of the group. And one of the problems that touches the fate of humanity is whether such an accommodation can be reached by means of some particular form of civilization, or whether this conflict is irreconcilable. By allowing common feeling to be our guide in deciding what features of human life are to be regarded as civilized, we have obtained a clear impression of the general picture of civilization. But it is true that so far we have discovered nothing that is not universally known. At the same time, we have been careful not to fall in with the prejudice that civilization is synonymous with perfecting, that it is the road to perfection preordained for men. But now a point of view presents itself which may lead in a different direction. The development of civilization appears to us as a peculiar process which mankind undergoes, and in which several things strike us as familiar. We may characterize this process with reference to the changes which it brings about in the familiar instinctual dispositions of human beings, to satisfy which is, after all, the economic task of our lives. A few of these instincts are used up in such a manner that something appears in their place, which, in an individual, we describe as a character trait. The most remarkable example of such a process is found in the anal eroticism of young human beings. Their original interest in the excretory function, its organs and products, is changed in the course of their growth into a group of traits which are familiar to us as parsimony, a sense of order and cleanliness, qualities which, though valuable and welcome in themselves, may be intensified till they become markedly dominant and produce what is called the anal character. How this happens, we do not know, but there is no doubt about the correctness of the finding. Now we have seen that order and cleanliness are important requirements of civilization, although their vital necessity is not very apparent, any more than their suitability as sources of enjoyment. At this point, we cannot fail to be struck by the similarity between the process of civilization and the libidinal development of the individual. Other instincts, besides anal eroticism, are induced to displace the conditions for their satisfaction, to lead them into other paths. In most cases, this process coincides with that of the sublimation of instinctual aims, with which we are familiar, but in some it can be differentiated from it. Sublimation of instinct is an especially conspicuous feature of cultural development. It is what makes it possible for higher psychical activities, scientific, artistic, or ideological, to play such an important part in civilized life. If one were to yield to a first impression, one would say that sublimation is a vicissitude which has been forced upon the instincts entirely by civilization. But it would be wiser to reflect upon this a little longer. In the third place, finally, and this seems the most important of all, it is impossible to overlook the extent to which civilization is built up upon a renunciation of instinct, how much it presupposes precisely the non-satisfaction by suppression, repression, or some other means, of powerful instincts. This cultural frustration dominates the large field of social relationships between human beings. As we already know, it is the cause of the hostility against which all civilizations have to struggle. It will also make severe demands on our scientific work, and we shall have much to explain here. It is not easy to understand how it can become possible to deprive an instinct of satisfaction, nor is doing so without danger. If the loss is not compensated for economically, one can be certain that serious disorders will ensue. But if we want to know what value can be attributed to our view that the development of civilization is a special process, comparable to the normal maturation of the individual, we must clearly attack another problem. We must ask ourselves, to what influences the development of civilization owes its origin, how it arose, and by what its course has been determined. 4. The task seems an immense one, and it is natural to feel diffidence in the face of it. But here are such conjectures as I have been able to make. After primal man had discovered that it lay in his own hands literally to improve his lot on earth by working, it cannot have been a matter of indifference to him whether another man worked with or against him. The other man acquired the value for him of a fellow worker with whom it was useful to live together. Even earlier, in his ape-like prehistory, man had adopted the habit of forming families, and the members of his family were probably his first helpers. One may suppose that the founding of families was connected with the fact that a moment came when the need for genital satisfaction no longer made its appearance like a guest who drops in suddenly and, after his departure, is heard of no more for a long time, but instead took up its quarters as a permanent lodger. When this happened, the male acquired a motive for keeping the female, or, speaking more generally, his sexual objects, near him, while the female, who did not want to be separated from her helpless young, was obliged in their interests to remain with the stronger male. In this primitive family, one essential feature of civilization is still lacking. The arbitrary will of its head, the father, was unrestricted. In Totem and Taboo, 1912-13, I have tried to show how the way led from this family to the succeeding stage of communal life in the form of bands of brothers. In overpowering their father, the sons had made the discovery that a combination can be stronger than a single individual. The totemic culture is based on the restrictions which the sons had to impose on one another in order to keep this new state of affairs in being. The taboo observances were the first rite or law. The communal life of human beings had therefore twofold foundation: the compulsion to work, which was created by external necessity, and the power of love, which made the man unwilling to be deprived of his sexual object, the woman, and made the woman unwilling to be deprived of the part of herself which had been separated off from her, her child. Eros and Ananke, love and necessity, have become the parents of human civilization too. The first result of civilization was that even a fairly large number of people were now able to live together in a community. And since these two great powers were cooperating in this, one might expect that the further development of civilization would proceed smoothly towards an even better control over the external world and towards a further extension of the number of people included in the community. Nor is it easy to understand how civilization could act upon its participants otherwise than to make them happy. Before we go on to inquire from what quarter an interference might arise, this recognition of love as one of the foundations of civilization may serve as an excuse for a digression which will enable us to fill in a gap which we left in an earlier discussion. We said there that man's discovery that sexual genital love afforded him the strongest experiences of satisfaction, and in fact provided him with the prototype of all happiness, must have suggested to him that he should continue to seek the satisfaction of happiness in his life along the path of sexual relations, and that he should make genital erotism the central point of his life. We went on to say that in doing so, he made himself dependent in a most dangerous way on a portion of the external world, namely, his chosen love object, exposed himself to extreme suffering if he should be rejected by that object, or should lose it through unfaithfulness or death. For that reason, the wise men of every age have warned us most emphatically against this way of life. But, in spite of this, it has not lost its attraction for a great number of people. A small minority are enabled by their constitution to find happiness in spite of everything along the path of love. But far-reaching mental changes in the function of love are necessary before this can happen. These people make themselves independent of their object's acquiescence by displacing what they mainly value from being loved onto loving. They protect themselves against the loss of the object by directing their love, not to single objects, but to all men alike. And they avoid the uncertainties and disappointments of genital love by turning away from its sexual aims and transforming the instinct into an impulse with an inhibited aim. What they bring about in themselves in this way is a state of evenly suspended, steadfast, affectionate feeling, which has little external resemblance any more to the stormy agitations of genital love from which it is nevertheless derived. Perhaps St. Francis of Assisi went furthest in thus exploiting love for the benefit of an inner feeling of happiness. Moreover, what we have recognized as one of the techniques for fulfilling the pleasure principle has often been brought into connection with religion. This connection may lie in the remote regions where the distinction between the ego and objects, or between objects themselves, is neglected. According to one ethical view, whose deeper motivation will become clear to us presently, this readiness for a universal love of mankind and the world represents the highest standpoint which man can reach. Even at this early stage of the discussion, I should like to bring forward my two main objections to this view. A love that does not discriminate seems to me to forfeit a part of its own value by doing an injustice to its object. And secondly, not all men are worthy of love. The love which founded the family continues to operate in civilization both in its original form, in which it does not renounce direct sexual satisfaction, and in its modified form, as aim-inhibited affection. In each, it continues to carry on its function of binding together considerable numbers of people, and it does so in a more intensive fashion than can be effected through the interest of work in common. The careless way in which language uses the word love has its genetic justification. People give the name love to the relation between a man and a woman whose genital needs have led them to found a family. But they also give the name love to the positive feelings between parents and children and between the brothers and sisters of a family, although we are obliged to describe this as aim-inhibited love or affection. Love with an inhibited aim was in fact originally fully sensual love, and it is so still in man's unconscious. Both fully sensual love and aim-inhibited love extend outside the family and create new bonds with people who before were strangers. Genital love leads to the formation of new families, and aim-inhibited love to friendships, which become valuable from a cultural standpoint because they escape some of the limitations of genital love, as, for instance, its exclusiveness. But in the course of development, the relation of love to civilization loses its unambiguity. On the one hand, love comes into opposition to the interests of civilization. On the other, civilization threatens love with substantial restrictions. This rift between them seems unavoidable. The reason for it is not immediately recognizable. It expresses itself, at first, as a conflict between the family and the larger community to which the individual belongs. We have already perceived that one of the main endeavors of civilization is to bring people together into large unities. But the family will not give the individual up. The more closely the members of a family are attached to one another, the more often do they tend to cut themselves off from others, and the more difficult it is for them to enter into the wider circle of life. The mode of life in common which is phylogenetically the older and which is the only one that exists in childhood, will not let itself be superseded by the cultural mode of life which has been acquired later. Detaching himself from his family becomes a task that faces every young person, and society often helps him in the solution of it by means of puberty and initiation rites. We get the impression that these are difficulties which are inherent in all psychical, and indeed at bottom in all organic development. Furthermore, women soon come into opposition to civilization and display their retarding and restraining influence. Those very women who, in the beginning, laid the foundations of civilization by the claims of their love. Women represent the interests of the family and of sexual life. The work of civilization has become increasingly the business of men. It confronts them with ever more difficult tasks and compels them to carry out instinctual sublimations of which women are little capable. Since a man does not have unlimited quantities of psychical energy at his disposal, he has to accomplish his tasks by making an expedient distribution of his libido. What he employs for cultural aims, he to a great extent withdraws from women and sexual life. His constant association with men and his dependence on his relations with them even estrange him from his duties as a husband and father. Thus, the woman finds herself forced into the background by the claims of civilization, and she adopts a hostile attitude towards it. The tendency on the part of civilization to restrict sexual life is no less clear than its other tendency to expand the cultural unit. Its first totemic phase already brings with it the prohibition against an incestuous choice of object, and this is perhaps the most drastic mutilation which man's erotic life has in all time experienced. Taboos, laws, and customs impose further restrictions, which affect both men and women. Not all civilizations go equally far in this, and the economic structure of the society also influences the amount of sexual freedom that remains. Here, as we already know, civilization is obeying the laws of economic necessity, since a large amount of the psychical energy which it uses for its own purposes has to be withdrawn from sexuality. In this respect, civilization behaves towards sexuality as a people or a stratum of its population does, which has subjected another one to its exploitation. Fear of a revolt by the suppressed elements drives it to stricter precautionary measures. A high watermark in such development has been reached in our Western European civilization. A cultural community is perfectly justified, psychologically, in starting by prescribing manifestations of the sexual life of children, for there would be no prospect of curbing the sexual lust of adults if the ground had not been prepared for it in childhood. But such a community cannot in any way be justified in going to the length of actually disavowing such easily demonstrable and indeed striking phenomena. As regards the sexually mature individual, the choice of an object is restricted to the opposite sex, and most extragenital satisfactions are forbidden as perversions. The requirement demonstrated in these prohibitions, that there shall be a single kind of sexual life for everyone, disregards the dissimilarities, whether innate or acquired, in the sexual constitution of human beings. It cuts off a fair number of them from sexual enjoyment, and so becomes the source of serious injustice. The result of such restrictive measures might be that in people who are normal, who are not prevented by their constitution, the whole of their sexual interests would flow without loss into the channels that are left open. But heterosexual genital love, which has remained exempt from outlawry, is itself restricted by further limitations in the shape of insistence upon legitimacy and monogamy. Present-day civilization makes it plain that it will only permit sexual relationships on the basis of a solitary, indissoluble bond between one man and one woman, and that it does not like sexuality as a source of pleasure in its own right, and is only prepared to tolerate it because there is so far no substitute for it as a means of propagating the human race. This, of course, is an extreme picture. Everybody knows that it has proved impossible to put it into execution, even for quite short periods. Only the weaklings have submitted to such an extensive encroachment upon their sexual freedom, and stronger natures have only done so subject to a compensatory condition, which will be mentioned later. Civilized society has found itself obliged to pass over in silence many transgressions which, according to its own prescripts, it ought to have punished. But we must not err on the other side and assume that because it does not achieve all its aims, such an attitude on the part of society is entirely innocuous. The sexual life of civilized man is notwithstanding severely impaired. It sometimes gives the impression of being in process of involution as a function, just as our teeth and hair seem to be as organs. One is probably justified in assuming that its importance as a source of feelings of happiness and therefore in the fulfillment of our aim in life has sensibly diminished. Sometimes one seems to perceive that it is not only the pressure of civilization, but something in the nature of the function itself which denies us full satisfaction and urges us along other paths. This may be wrong. It is hard to decide. 5. Psychoanalytic work has shown us that it is precisely these frustrations of sexual life which people known as neurotics cannot tolerate. The neurotic creates substitutive satisfactions for himself in his symptoms, and these either cause him suffering in themselves or become sources of suffering for him by raising difficulties in his relations with his environment and the society he belongs to. The latter fact is easy to understand. The former presents us with a new problem. But civilization demands other sacrifices besides that of sexual satisfaction. We have treated the difficulty of cultural development as a general difficulty of development by tracing it to the inertia of the libido, to its disinclination to give up an old position for a new one. We are saying much the same thing when we derive the antithesis between civilization and sexuality from the circumstance that sexual love is a relationship between two individuals in which a third can only be superfluous or disturbing, whereas civilization depends on relationships between a considerable number of individuals. When a love relationship is at its height, there is no room left for any interest in the environment. A pair of lovers are sufficient to themselves, and do not even need the child they have in common to make them happy. In no other case does Eros so clearly betray the core of his being, his purpose of making one out of more than one. But when he has achieved this in the proverbial way through the love of two human beings, he refuses to go further. So far, we can quite well imagine a cultural community consisting of double individuals like this who, libidinally satisfied in themselves, are connected with one another through the bonds of common work and common interests. If this were so, civilization would not have to withdraw any energy from sexuality. But this desirable state of things does not and never did exist. Reality shows us that civilization is not content with the ties we have so far allowed it. It aims at binding the members of the community together in a libidinal way as well, and employs every means to that end. It favors every path by which strong identifications can be established between the members of the community, and it summons up aim-inhibited libido on the largest scale, so as to strengthen the communal bond by relations of friendship. In order for these aims to be fulfilled, a restriction upon sexual life is unavoidable. But we are unable to understand what the necessity is which forces civilization along this path, and which causes its antagonism to sexuality. There must be some disturbing factor which we have not yet discovered. The clue may be supplied by one of the ideal demands, as we have called them, of civilized society. It runs, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." It is known throughout the world and is undoubtedly older than Christianity, which puts it forward as its proudest claim. Yet it is certainly not very old. Even in historical times, it was still strange to mankind. Let us adopt a naive attitude towards it, as though we were hearing it for the first time. We shall be unable then to suppress a feeling of surprise and bewilderment. Why should we do it? What good will it do us? But above all, how shall we achieve it? How can it be possible? My love is something valuable to me which I ought not to throw away without reflection. It imposes duties on me for whose fulfillment I must be ready to make sacrifices. If I love someone, he must deserve it in some way. I leave out of account the use he may be to me, and also his possible significance for me as a sexual object. For neither of these two kinds of relationship comes into question where the precept to love my neighbour is concerned. He deserves it if he is so like me in important ways that I can love myself in him. And he deserves it if he is so much more perfect than myself that I can love my ideal of my own self in him. Again, I have to love him if he is my friend's son, since the pain my friend would feel if any harm came to him would be my pain too. I should have to share it. But if he is a stranger to me, and if he cannot attract me by any worth of his own or any significance that he may already have acquired for my emotional life, it will be hard for me to love him. Indeed, I should be wrong to do so, for my love is valued by all my own people as a sign of my preferring them, and it is an injustice to them if I put a stranger on a par with them. But if I am to love him, with this universal love, merely because he too is an inhabitant of this earth, like an insect, an earthworm, or a grass snake, then I fear that only a small modicum of my love will fall to his share. Not by any possibility as much as, by the judgment of my reason, I am entitled to retain for myself. What is the point of a precept enunciated with so much solemnity, if its fulfillment cannot be recommended as reasonable? On closer inspection I find still further difficulties. Not merely is this stranger in general unworthy of my love, I must honestly confess that he has more claim to my hostility, and even my hatred. He seems not to have the least trace of love for me, and shows me not the slightest consideration. If it will do him any good, he has no hesitation in injuring me, nor does he ask himself whether the amount of advantage he gains bears any proportion to the extent of the harm he does to me. Indeed, he need not even obtain an advantage. If he can satisfy any sort of desire by it, he thinks nothing of jeering at me, insulting me, slandering me, and showing his superior power. And the more secure he feels, the more helpless I am, the more certainly I can expect him to behave like this to me. If he behaves differently, if he shows me consideration and forbearance as a stranger, I am ready to treat him in the same way, in any case, and quite apart from any precept. Indeed, if this grandiose commandment had run, "Love thy neighbour as thy neighbour loves thee," I should not take exception to it. And there is a second commandment, which seems to me even more incomprehensible, and arouses still stronger opposition in me. It is, "Love thine enemies." If I think it over, however, I see that I am wrong in treating it as a greater imposition. At bottom, it is the same thing. I think I can now hear a dignified voice admonishing me. It is precisely because your neighbour is not worthy of love, and is, on the contrary, your enemy, that you should love him as yourself. I then understand that the case is one like that of credo quia absurdum. Now, it is very probable that my neighbour, when he is enjoined to love me as himself, will answer exactly as I have done, and will repel me for the same reasons. I hope he will not have the same objective grounds for doing so, but he will have the same idea as I have. Even so, the behaviour of human beings shows differences, which ethics, disregarding the fact that such differences are determined, classifies as good or bad. So long as these undeniable differences have not been removed, obedience to high ethical demands entails damage to the aims of civilization, for it puts a positive premium on being bad. One is irresistibly reminded of an incident in the French chamber when capital punishment was being debated. A member had been passionately supporting its abolition, and his speech was being received with tumultuous applause, when a voice from the hall called out, "Que Monsieur les Assassins commence!" The element of truth behind all this, which people are so ready to disavow, is that men are not gentle creatures who want to be loved, and who at the most can defend themselves if they are attacked. They are, on the contrary, creatures among whose instinctual endowments is to be reckoned a powerful share of aggressiveness. As a result, their neighbor is for them not only a potential helper or sexual object, but also someone who tempts them to satisfy their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without compensation, to use him sexually without his consent, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture, and to kill him. Homo homini lupus. Who, in the face of all his experience of life and of history, will have the courage to dispute this assertion? As a rule, this cruel aggressiveness waits for some provocation or puts itself at the service of some other purpose whose goal might also have been reached by milder measures. In circumstances that are favourable to it, when the mental counterforces which ordinarily inhibit it are out of action, it also manifests itself spontaneously, and reveals man as a savage beast to whom consideration towards his own kind is something alien. Anyone who calls to mind the atrocities committed during the racial migrations or the invasions of the Huns, or by the people known as Mongols under Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, or the capture of Jerusalem by the pious Crusaders, or even indeed the horrors of the recent World War. Anyone who calls these things to mind will have to bow humbly before the truth of this view. The existence of this inclination to aggression, which we can detect in ourselves and justly assume to be present in others, is the factor which disturbs our relations with our neighbour and which forces civilization into such a high expenditure of energy. In consequence of this primary mutual hostility of human beings, civilized society is perpetually threatened with disintegration. The interest of work in common would not hold it together. Instinctual passions are stronger than reasonable interests. Civilization has to use its utmost efforts in order to set limits to man's aggressive instincts, and to hold the manifestations of them in check by psychical reaction formations. Hence, therefore, the use of methods intended to incite people into identifications and aim inhibited relationships of love. Hence the restriction upon sexual life, and hence, too, the ideal's commandment to love one's neighbour as oneself, a commandment which is really justified by the fact that nothing else runs so strongly counter to the original nature of man. In spite of every effort, these endeavours of civilization have not so far achieved very much. It hopes to prevent the crudest excesses of brutal violence by itself assuming the right to use violence against criminals. But the law is not able to lay hold of the more cautious and refined manifestations of human aggressiveness. The time comes when each one of us has to give up as illusions the expectations which, in his youth, he pinned upon his fellow men, and when he may learn how much difficulty and pain has been added to his life by their ill will. At the same time, it would be unfair to reproach civilization with trying to eliminate strife and competition from human activity. These things are undoubtedly indispensable, but opposition is not necessarily enmity. It is merely misused and made an occasion for enmity. The communists believe that they have found the path to deliverance from our evils. According to them, man is wholly good and is well disposed to his neighbour. But the institution of private property has corrupted his nature. The ownership of private wealth gives the individual power, and with it the temptation to ill-treat his neighbour, while the man who is excluded from possession is bound to rebel in hostility against his oppressor. If private property were abolished, all wealth held in common, and everyone allowed to share in the enjoyment of it, ill will and hostility would disappear among men. Since everyone's needs would be satisfied, no one would have any reason to regard another as his enemy. All would willingly undertake the work that was necessary. I have no concern with any economic criticisms of the communist system. I cannot inquire into whether the abolition of private property is expedient or advantageous. But I am able to recognize that the psychological premises on which the system is based are an untenable illusion. In abolishing private property, we deprive the human love of aggression of one of its instruments, certainly a strong one, though certainly not the strongest. But we have in no way altered the differences in power and influence which are misused by aggressiveness, nor have we altered anything in its nature. Aggressiveness was not created by property. It reigned almost without limit in primitive times, when property was still very scanty. And it already shows itself in the nursery almost before property has given up its primal, anal form. It forms the basis of every relation of affection and love among people, with the single exception, perhaps, of the mother's relation to her male child. If we do away with personal rights over material wealth, there still remains prerogative in the field of sexual relationships, which is bound to become the source of the strongest dislike and the most violent hostility among men who, in other respects, are on an equal footing. If we were to remove this factor too by allowing complete freedom of sexual life and thus abolishing the family, the germ cell of civilization, we cannot, it is true, easily foresee what new paths the development of civilization could take. But one thing we can expect, and that is that this indestructible feature of human nature will follow it there. It is clearly not easy for men to give up the satisfaction of this inclination to aggression. They do not feel comfortable without it. The advantage which a comparatively small cultural group offers of allowing this instinct an outlet in the form of hostility against intruders is not to be despised. It is always possible to bind together a considerable number of people in love so long as there are other people left over to receive the manifestations of their aggressiveness. I once discussed the phenomenon that it is precisely communities with adjoining territories, and related to each other in other ways as well, who are engaged in constant feuds and in ridiculing each other. Like the Spaniards and Portuguese, for instance, the North Germans and South Germans, the English and Scotch, and so on. I gave this phenomenon the name of the narcissism of minor differences, a name which does not do much to explain it. We can now see that it is a convenient and relatively harmless satisfaction of the inclination to aggression by means of which cohesion between the members of the community is made easier. In this respect, the Jewish people, scattered everywhere, have rendered most useful services to the civilizations of countries that have been their hosts. But unfortunately, all the massacres of the Jews in the Middle Ages did not suffice to make that period more peaceful and secure for their Christian fellows. When once the Apostle Paul had posited universal love between men as the foundation of his Christian community, extreme intolerance on the part of Christendom towards those who remained outside it became the inevitable consequence. To the Romans, who had not founded their communal life as a state upon love, religious intolerance was something foreign, although with them religion was a concern of the state, and the state was permeated by religion. Neither was it as unaccountable chance that the dream of a Germanic world dominion called for anti-Semitism as its complement. And it is intelligible that the attempt to establish a new communist civilization in Russia should find its psychological support in the persecution of the bourgeois. One only wonders with concern what the Soviets will do after they have wiped out their bourgeois. If civilization imposes such great sacrifices not only on man's sexuality but on his aggressivity, we can understand better why it is hard for him to be happy in that civilization. In fact, primitive man was better off in knowing no restrictions of instinct. To counterbalance this, his prospects of enjoying this happiness for any length of time were very slender. Civilized man has exchanged a portion of his possibilities of happiness for a portion of security. We must not forget, however, that in the primal family only the head of it enjoyed this instinctual freedom. The rest lived in slavish suppression. In that primal period of civilization, the contrast between a minority who enjoyed the advantages of civilization and a majority who were robbed of those advantages was, therefore, carried to extremes. As regards the primitive peoples who exist today, careful researches have shown that their instinctual life is by no means to be envied for its freedom. It is subject to restrictions of a different kind, but perhaps of greater severity than those attaching to modern civilized man. When we justly find fault with the present state of our civilization for so inadequately fulfilling our demands for a plan of life that shall make us happy, and for allowing the existence of so much suffering which could probably be avoided, when, with unsparing criticism, we try to uncover the roots of its imperfection, we are undoubtedly exercising a proper right, and are not showing ourselves enemies of civilization. We may expect gradually to carry through such alterations in our civilization as will better satisfy our needs and will escape our criticisms. But perhaps we may also familiarize ourselves with the idea that there are difficulties attaching to the nature of civilization which will not yield to any attempt at reform. Over and above the tasks of restricting the instincts which we are prepared for, there forces itself on our notice the danger of a state of things which might be termed the psychological poverty of groups. This danger is most threatening where the bonds of a society are chiefly constituted by the identification of its members with one another, while individuals of the leader type do not acquire the importance that should fall to them in the formation of a group. The present cultural state of America would give us a good opportunity for studying the damage to civilization which is thus to be feared. But I shall avoid the temptation of entering upon a critique of American civilization. I do not wish to give an impression of wanting myself to employ American methods. 6. In none of my previous writings have I had so strong a feeling as now that what I am describing is common knowledge, and that I am using up paper and ink and, in due course, the compositors' and printers' work and material in order to expound things which are, in fact, self-evident. For that reason, I should be glad to seize the point if it were to appear that the recognition of a special, independent, aggressive instinct means an alteration of the psychoanalytic theory of the instincts. We shall see, however, that this is not so, and that it is merely a matter of bringing into sharper focus a turn of thought arrived at long ago and of following out its consequences. Of all the slowly developed parts of analytic theory, the theory of the instincts is the one that has felt its way the most painfully forward. And yet that theory was so indispensable to the whole structure that something had to be put in its place. In what was at first my utter perplexity, I took as my starting point a saying of the poet-philosopher Schiller that hunger and love are what moves the world. Hunger could be taken to represent the instincts which aim at preserving the individual, while love strives after objects, and its chief function, favoured in every way by nature, is the preservation of the species. Thus, to begin with, ego instincts and object instincts confronted each other. It was to denote the energy of the latter and only the latter instincts that I introduced the term libido. Thus the antithesis was between the ego instincts and the libidinal instincts of love, in its widest sense, which were directed to an object. One of these object instincts, the sadistic instinct, stood out from the rest, it is true, in that its aim was so very far from being loving. Moreover, it was obviously in some respects attached to the ego instincts. It could not hide its close affinity with instincts of mastery which have no libidinal purpose. But these discrepancies were got over. After all, sadism was clearly a part of sexual life, in the activities of which affection could be replaced by cruelty. Neurosis was regarded as the outcome of a struggle between the interest of self-preservation and the demands of the libido, a struggle in which the ego had been victorious, but at the price of severe sufferings and renunciations. Every analyst will admit that even today this view has not the sound of a long discarded error. Nevertheless, alterations in it became essential as our inquiries advanced from the repressed to the repressing forces, from the object instincts to the ego. The decisive step forward was the introduction of the concept of narcissism. That is to say, the discovery that the ego itself is cathected with libido, that the ego, indeed, is the libido's original home, and remains to some extent its headquarters. The narcissistic libido turns towards objects and thus becomes object libido, and it can change back into narcissistic libido once more. The concept of narcissism made it possible to obtain an analytic understanding of the traumatic neuroses and of many of the affections bordering on the psychoses, as well as of the latter themselves. It was not necessary to give up our interpretations of the transference neuroses as attempts made by the ego to defend itself against sexuality. But the concept of libido was endangered. Since the ego instincts too were libidinal, it seemed for a time inevitable that we should make libido coincide with instinctual energy in general, as C.G. Jung had already advocated earlier. Nevertheless, there still remained in me a kind of conviction, from which I was not as yet able to find reasons, that the instincts could not all be of the same kind. My next step was taken in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920, when the compulsion to repeat and the conservative character of instinctual life first attracted my attention. Starting from speculations on the beginning of life and from biological parallels, I drew the conclusion that, besides the instinct to preserve living substance and to join it into ever larger units, there must exist another, contrary instinct, seeking to dissolve those units, and to bring them back to their primeval, inorganic state. That is to say, as well as eros, there was an instinct of death. The phenomena of life could be explained from the concurrent or mutually opposing action of these two instincts. It was not easy, however, to demonstrate the activities of this supposed death instinct. The manifestations of eros were conspicuous and noisy enough. It might be assumed that the death instinct operated silently within the organism towards its dissolution. But that, of course, was no proof. A more fruitful idea was that a portion of the instinct is diverted towards the external world and comes to light as an instinct of aggressiveness and destructiveness. In this way, the instinct itself could be pressed into the service of eros, in that the organism was destroying some other thing, whether animate or inanimate, instead of destroying its own self. Conversely, any restriction of this aggressiveness directed outwards would be bound to increase the self-destruction, which is, in any case, proceeding. At the same time, one can suspect from this example that the two kinds of instinct seldom, perhaps never, appear in isolation from each other, but are alloyed with each other in varying and very different proportions, and so become unrecognizable to our judgment. In sadism, long since known to us as a component instinct of sexuality, we should have before us a particularly strong alloy of this kind between trends of love and the destructive instinct, while its counterpart, masochism, would be a union between destructiveness directed inwards and sexuality, a union which makes what is otherwise an imperceptible trend into a conspicuous and tangible one. The assumption of the existence of an instinct of death or destruction has met with resistance even in analytic circles. I am aware that there is a frequent inclination rather to ascribe whatever is dangerous and hostile in love to an original bipolarity in its own nature. To begin with, it was only tentatively that I put forward the views I have developed here, but in the course of time they have gained such a hold upon me that I can no longer think in any other way. To my mind, they are far more serviceable from a theoretical standpoint than any other possible ones. They provide that simplification without either ignoring or doing violence to the facts, for which we strive in scientific work. I know that in sadism and masochism we have always seen before us manifestations of the destructive instinct, directed outwards and inwards, strongly alloyed with erotism. But I no longer understand how we can have overlooked the ubiquity of non-erotic aggressivity and destructiveness, and can have failed to give it its due place in our interpretation of life. The desire for destruction, when it is directed inwards, mostly eludes our perception, of course, unless it is tinged with erotism. I remember my own defensive attitude when the idea of an instinct of destruction first emerged in psychoanalytic literature, and how long it took before I became receptive to it. That others should have shown and still show the same attitude of rejection surprises me less. For little children do not like it, when there is talk of the inborn human inclination to badness, to aggressiveness and destructiveness, and so to cruelty as well. God has made them in the image of His own perfection. Nobody wants to be reminded how hard it is to reconcile the undeniable existence of evil, despite the protestations of Christian Science, with his all-powerfulness or his all-goodness. The devil would be the best way out as an excuse for God. In that way, he would be playing the same part as an agent of economic discharge as the Jew does in the world of the Aryan ideal. But even so, one can hold God responsible for the existence of the devil just as well as for the existence of the wickedness which the devil embodies. In view of these difficulties, each of us will be well advised, on some suitable occasion, to make a low bow to the deeply moral nature of mankind. It will help us to be generally popular, and much will be forgiven us for it. The name libido can once more be used to denote the manifestations of the power of eros in order to distinguish them from the energy of the death instinct. It must be confessed that we have much greater difficulty in grasping that instinct. We can only suspect it, as it were, as something in the background, behind eros, and it escapes detection unless its presence is betrayed by its being alloyed with eros. It is in sadism, where the death instinct twists the erotic aim in its own sense and yet at the same time fully satisfies the erotic urge, that we succeed in obtaining the clearest insight into its nature and its relation to eros. But even where it emerges without any sexual purpose, in the blindest fury of destructiveness, we cannot fail to recognize that the satisfaction of the instinct is accompanied by an extraordinarily high degree of narcissistic enjoyment, owing to its presenting the ego with the fulfillment of the latter's old wishes for omnipotence. The instinct of destruction, moderated and tamed, and, as it were, inhibited in its aim, must, when it is directed towards objects, provide the ego with the satisfaction of its vital needs and with control over nature. Since the assumption of the existence of the instinct is mainly based on theoretical grounds, we must also admit that it is not entirely proof against theoretical objections. But this is how things appear to us now in the present state of our knowledge. Future research and reflection will no doubt bring further light, which will decide the matter. In all that follows, I adopt the standpoint, therefore, that the inclination to aggression is an original, self-subsisting instinctual disposition in man, and I return to my view that it constitutes the greatest impediment to civilization. At one point in the course of this inquiry, I was led to the idea that civilization was a special process which mankind undergoes, and I am still under the influence of that idea. I may now add that civilization is a process in the service of eros, whose purpose is to combine single human individuals, and after that families, then races, peoples, and nations into one great unity, the unity of mankind. Why this has to happen, we do not know. The work of eros is precisely this. These collections of men are to be libidinally bound to one another. Necessity alone, the advantages of work in common, will not hold them together, but man's natural aggressive instinct, the hostility of each against all and of all against each, opposes this program of civilization. This aggressive instinct is the derivative and the main representative of the death instinct, which we have found alongside of eros and which shares world dominion with it. And now, I think, the meaning of the evolution of civilization is no longer obscure to us. It must present the struggle between eros and death, between the instinct of life and the instinct of destruction, as it works itself out in the human species. This struggle is what all life essentially consists of, and the evolution of civilization may therefore be simply described as the struggle for life of the human species. And it is this battle of the giants that our nursemaids try to appease with their lullaby about heaven. 7. Why do our relatives, the animals, not exhibit any such cultural struggle? We do not know. Very probably some of them, the bees, the ants, the termites, strove for thousands of years before they arrived at the state institutions, the distribution of functions and the restrictions on the individual for which we admire them today. It is a mark of our present condition that we know from our own feelings that we should not think ourselves happy in any of these animal states, or in any of the roles assigned in them to the individual. In the case of other animal species, it may be that a temporary balance has been reached between the influences of their environment and the mutually contending instincts within them, and that thus a cessation of development has come about. It may be that in primitive man a fresh access of libido kindled a renewed burst of activity on the part of the destructive instinct. There are a great many questions here to which as yet there is no answer. Another question concerns us more nearly. What means does civilization employ in order to inhibit the aggressiveness which opposes it, to make it harmless, to get rid of it, perhaps? We have already become acquainted with a few of these methods, but not yet with the one that appears to be the most important. This we can study in the history of the development of the individual. What happens in him to render his desire for aggression innocuous? Something very remarkable which we should never have guessed, and which is nevertheless quite obvious. His aggressiveness is introjected, internalized. It is, in point of fact, sent back to where it came from. That is, it is directed towards his own ego. There it is taken over by a portion of the ego which sets itself over against the rest of the ego as superego, and which now, in the form of conscience, is ready to put into action against the ego the same harsh aggressiveness that the ego would have liked to satisfy upon other extraneous individuals. The tension between the harsh superego and the ego that is subjected to it is called by us the sense of guilt. It expresses itself as a need for punishment. Civilization, therefore, obtains mastery over the individual's dangerous desire for aggression by weakening and disarming it, and by setting up an agency within him to watch over it, like a garrison in a conquered city. As to the origin of the sense of guilt, the analyst has different views from other psychologists, but even he does not find it easy to give an account of it. To begin with, if we ask how a person comes to have a sense of guilt, we arrive at an answer which cannot be disputed. A person feels guilty, devout people would say sinful, when he has done something which he knows to be bad. But then we notice how little this answer tells us. Perhaps, after some hesitation, we shall add that even when a person has not actually done the bad thing, but has only recognized in himself an intention to do it, he may regard himself as guilty. And the question then arises of why the intention is regarded as equal to the deed. Both cases, however, presuppose that one had already recognized that what is bad is reprehensible, is something that must not be carried out. How is this judgment arrived at? We may reject the existence of an original, or as it were, natural capacity to distinguish good from bad. What is bad is often not at all what is injurious or dangerous to the ego. On the contrary, it may be something which is desirable and enjoyable to the ego. Here, therefore, there is an extraneous influence at work, and it is this that decides what is to be called good or bad. Since a person's own feelings would not have led him along this path, he must have had a motive for submitting to this extraneous influence. Such a motive is easily discovered in his helplessness and his dependence on other people, and it can best be designated as fear of loss of love. If he loses the love of another person upon whom he is dependent, he also ceases to be protected from a variety of dangers. Above all, he is exposed to the danger that this stronger person will show his superiority in the form of punishment. At the beginning, therefore, what is bad is whatever causes one to be threatened with loss of love. For fear of that loss, one must avoid it. This, too, is the reason why it makes little difference whether one has already done the bad thing or only intends to do it. In either case, the danger only sets in if and when the authority discovers it, and in either case, the authority would behave in the same way. This state of mind is called a bad conscience, but actually it does not deserve this name, for at this stage the sense of guilt is clearly only a fear of loss of love, social anxiety. In small children it can never be anything else, but in many adults too, it has only changed to the extent that the place of the father or the two parents is taken by the larger human community. Consequently, such people habitually allow themselves to do any bad thing which promises them enjoyment so long as they are sure that the authority will not know anything about it or cannot blame them for it. They are afraid only of being found out. Present-day society has to reckon in general with this state of mind. A great change takes place only when the authority is internalized through the establishment of the superego. The phenomena of conscience then reach a higher stage. Actually, it is not until now that we should speak of conscience or a sense of guilt. At this point, too, the fear of being found out comes to an end. The distinction, moreover, between doing something bad and wishing to do it disappears entirely, since nothing can be hidden from the superego, not even thoughts. It is true that the seriousness of the situation from a real point of view has passed away. For the new authority, the superego has no motive that we know of for ill-treating the ego, with which it is intimately bound up. But genetic influence, which leads to the survival of what is past and has been surmounted, makes itself felt in the fact that fundamentally things remain as they were at the beginning. The superego torments the sinful ego with the same feeling of anxiety, and is on the watch for opportunities of getting it punished by the external world. At this second stage of development, the conscience exhibits a peculiarity which was absent from the first stage, and which is no longer easy to account for. For the more virtuous a man is, the more severe and distrustful is its behavior, so that ultimately it is precisely those people who have carried saintliness furthest who reproach themselves with the worst sinfulness. This means that virtue forfeits some part of promised reward. The docile and continent ego does not enjoy the trust of its mentor and strives in vain, it would seem, to acquire it. The objection will at once be made that these difficulties are artificial ones, and it will be said that a stricter and more vigilant conscience is precisely the hallmark of a moral man. Moreover, when saints call themselves sinners, they are not so wrong, considering the temptations to instinctual satisfaction to which they are exposed in a specially high degree, since, as is well known, temptations are merely increased by constant frustration, whereas an occasional satisfaction of them causes them to diminish, at least for the time being. The field of ethics, which is so full of problems, presents us with another fact, namely that ill luck, that is, external frustration, so greatly enhances the power of the conscience in the superego. As long as things go well with a man, his conscience is lenient and lets the ego do all sorts of things. But when misfortune befalls him, he searches his soul, acknowledges his sinfulness, heightens the demands of his conscience, imposes abstinences on himself, and punishes himself with penances. Whole peoples have behaved in this way, and still do. This, however, is easily explained by the original infantile stage of conscience, which, as we see, is not given up after the introjection into the superego, but persists alongside of it and behind it. Fate is regarded as a substitute for the parental agency. If a man is unfortunate, it means that he is no longer loved by this highest power, and threatened by such a loss of love, he once more bows to the parental representative in his superego, a representative whom, in his days of good fortune, he was ready to neglect. This becomes especially clear where fate is looked upon in the strictly religious sense of being nothing else than an expression of the divine will. The people of Israel had believed themselves to be the favorite child of God, and when the Great Father caused misfortune after misfortune to rain down upon this people of his, they were never shaken in their belief in his relationship to them or questioned his power or righteousness. Instead, they produced the prophets, who held up their sinfulness before them, and out of their sense of guilt, they created the over-strict commandments of their priestly religion. It is remarkable how differently a primitive man behaves. If he has met with a misfortune, he does not throw the blame on himself, but on his fetish, which has obviously not done its duty, and he gives it a thrashing instead of punishing himself. Thus we know of two origins of the sense of guilt, one arising from fear of an authority, and the other, later on, arising from fear of the superego. The first insists upon a renunciation of instinctual satisfactions. The second, as well as doing this, presses for punishment, since the continuance of the forbidden wishes cannot be concealed from the superego. We have also learned how the severity of the superego, the demands of conscience, is to be understood. It is simply a continuation of the severity of the external authority to which it has succeeded and which it has in part replaced. We now see in what relationship the renunciation of instinct stands to the sense of guilt. Originally, renunciation of instinct was the result of fear of an external authority. One renounced one's satisfactions in order not to lose its love. If one has carried out this renunciation, one is, as it were, quits with the authority, and no sense of guilt should remain. But with fear of the superego, the case is different. Here, instinctual renunciation is not enough, for the wish persists and cannot be concealed from the superego. Thus, in spite of the renunciation that has been made, a sense of guilt comes about. This constitutes a great economic disadvantage in the erection of a superego, or, as we may put it, in the formation of a conscience. Instinctual renunciation now no longer has a completely liberating effect. Virtuous continence is no longer rewarded with the assurance of love. A threatened external unhappiness, loss of love and punishment on the part of the external authority, has been exchanged for a permanent internal unhappiness, for the tension of the sense of guilt. These interrelations are so complicated and at the same time so important that at the risk of repeating myself, I shall approach them from yet another angle. The chronological sequence, then, would be as follows. First comes renunciation of instinct owing to fear of aggression by the external authority. This is, of course, what fear of the loss of love amounts to, for love is a protection against this punitive aggression. After that comes the erection of an internal authority and renunciation of instinct owing to fear of it, owing to fear of conscience. In this second situation, bad intentions are equated with bad action, and hence come a sense of guilt and a need for punishment. The aggressiveness of conscience keeps up the aggressiveness of the authority. So far, things have no doubt been made clear. But where does this leave room for the reinforcing influence of misfortune, of renunciation imposed from without, and for the extraordinary severity of conscience in the best and most tractable people? We have already explained both these peculiarities of conscience, but we probably still have an impression that those explanations do not go to the bottom of the matter, and leave a residue still unexplained. And here at last an idea comes in which belongs entirely to psychoanalysis, and which is foreign to people's ordinary way of thinking. This idea is of a sort which enables us to understand why the subject matter was bound to seem so confused and obscure to us. For it tells us that conscience, or more correctly the anxiety which later becomes conscience, is indeed the cause of instinctual renunciation to begin with, but that later the relationship is reversed. Every renunciation of instinct now becomes a dynamic source of conscience, and every fresh renunciation increases the latter's severity and intolerance. If we could only bring it better into harmony with what we already know about the history of the origin of conscience, we should be tempted to defend the paradoxical statement that conscience is the result of instinctual renunciation, or that instinctual renunciation, imposed on us from without, creates conscience, which then demands further instinctual renunciation. The contradiction between this statement and what we have previously said about the genesis of conscience is, in point of fact, not so very great, and we see a way of further reducing it. In order to make our exposition easier, let us take as our example the aggressive instinct, and let us assume that the renunciation in question is always a renunciation of aggression. This, of course, is only to be taken as a temporary assumption. The effect of instinctual renunciation on the conscience, then, is that every piece of aggression whose satisfaction the subject gives up is taken over by the superego and increases the latter's aggressiveness against the ego. This does not harmonize well with the view that the original aggressive mess of conscience is a continuance of the severity of the external authority and therefore has nothing to do with renunciation. But the discrepancy is removed if we postulate a different derivation for this first installment of the superego's aggressivity. A considerable amount of aggressiveness must be developed in the child against the authority which prevents him from having his first, but nonetheless his most important, satisfactions, whatever the kind of instinctual deprivation that is demanded of him may be. But he is obliged to renounce the satisfaction of this revengeful aggressiveness. He finds his way out of this economically difficult situation with the help of familiar mechanisms. By means of identification, he takes the unattackable authority into himself. The authority now turns into his superego and enters into possession of all the aggressiveness which a child would have liked to exercise against it. The child's ego has to content itself with the unhappy role of the authority, the father, who has been thus degraded. Here, as so often, the real situation is reversed. If I were the father and you were the child, I should treat you badly. The relationship between the superego and the ego is a return, distorted by a wish, of the real relationships between the ego, as yet undivided, and an external object. That is typical too. But the essential difference is that the original severity of the superego does not, or does not so much, represent the severity which one has experienced from it, the object, or which one attributes to it. It represents rather one's own aggressiveness towards it. If this is correct, we may assert truly that in the beginning conscience arises through the suppression of an aggressive impulse, and that it is subsequently reinforced by fresh suppressions of the same kind. Which of these two views is correct? The earlier one, which genetically seems so unassailable, or the newer one which rounds off the theory in such a welcome fashion? Clearly, and by the evidence too of direct observations, both are justified. They do not contradict each other, and they even coincide at one point, for the child's revengeful aggressiveness will be in part determined by the amount of punitive aggression which he expects from his father. Experience shows, however, that the severity of the superego which a child develops in no way corresponds to the severity of treatment which he has himself met with. The severity of the former seems to be independent of that of the latter. A child who has been very leniently brought up can acquire a very strict conscience. But it would also be wrong to exaggerate this independence. It is not difficult to convince oneself that severity of upbringing does also exert a strong influence on the formation of a child's superego. What it amounts to is that in the formation of the superego and the emergence of a conscience, innate constitutional factors and influences from the real environment act in combination. This is not at all surprising. On the contrary, it is a universal etiological condition for all such processes. It can also be asserted that when a child reacts to his first great instinctual frustrations with excessively strong aggressiveness, and with a correspondingly severe superego, he is following a phylogenetic model and is going beyond the response that would be currently justified. For the father of prehistoric times was undoubtedly terrible, and an extreme amount of aggressiveness may be attributed to him. Thus, if one shifts over from individual to phylogenetic development, the differences between the two theories of the genesis of conscience are still further diminished. On the other hand, a new and important difference makes its appearance between these two developmental processes. We cannot get away from the assumption that man's sense of guilt springs from the Oedipus complex, and was acquired at the killing of the father by the brothers banded together. On that occasion, an act of aggression was not suppressed but carried out. But it was the same act of aggression whose suppression in the child is supposed to be the source of his sense of guilt. At this point, I should not be surprised if the reader were to exclaim angrily, "So it makes no difference whether one kills one's father or not. One gets a feeling of guilt in either case." We may take leave to raise a few doubts here. Either it is not true that the sense of guilt comes from suppressed aggressiveness, or else the whole story of the killing of the father is a fiction, and the children of primeval man did not kill their fathers any more often than children do nowadays. Besides, if it is not a fiction but a plausible piece of history, it would be a case of something happening which everyone expects to happen, namely, of a person feeling guilty because he really has done something which cannot be justified. And of this event, which is after all an everyday occurrence, psychoanalysis has not yet given any explanation. That is true, and we must make good the omission. Nor is there any great secret about the matter. When one has a sense of guilt after having committed a misdeed, and because of it, the feeling should more properly be called remorse. It relates only to a deed that has been done, and of course it presupposes that a conscience, the readiness to feel guilty, was already in existence before the deed took place. Remorse of this sort can, therefore, never help us to discover the origin of conscience and of the sense of guilt in general. What happens in these everyday cases is usually this. An instinctual need acquires the strength to achieve satisfaction in spite of the conscience, which is, after all, limited in its strength. And with the natural weakening of the need owing to its having been satisfied, the former balance of power is restored. Psychoanalysis is thus justified in excluding from the present discussion the case of a sense of guilt due to remorse, however frequently such cases occur and however great their practical importance. But if the human sense of guilt goes back to the killing of the primal father, that was, after all, a case of remorse. Are we to assume that, at that time, a conscience and a sense of guilt were not, as we have presupposed, in existence before the deed? If not, where, in this case, did the remorse come from? There is no doubt that this case should explain the secret of the sense of guilt to us and put an end to our difficulties. And I believe it does. This remorse was the result of the primordial ambivalence of feeling towards the father. His sons hated him, but they loved him too. After their hatred had been satisfied by their act of aggression, their love came to the fore in their remorse for the deed. It set up the superego by identification with the father. It gave that agency the father's power, as though as a punishment for the deed of aggression they had carried out against him, and it created the restrictions which were intended to prevent a repetition of the deed. And since the inclination to aggressiveness against the father was repeated in the following generations, the sense of guilt too persisted, and it was reinforced once more by every piece of aggressiveness that was suppressed and carried over to the superego. Now I think we can at last grasp two things perfectly clearly: the part played by love in the origin of conscience, and the fatal inevitability of the sense of guilt. Whether one has killed one's father or has abstained from doing so is not really the decisive thing. One is bound to feel guilty in either case, for the sense of guilt is an expression of the conflict due to ambivalence, of the eternal struggle between eros and the instinct of destruction or death. This conflict is set going as soon as men are faced with the task of living together. So long as the community assumes no other form than that of the family, the conflict is bound to express itself in the Oedipus complex, to establish the conscience, and to create the first sense of guilt. When an attempt is made to widen the community, the same conflict is continued in forms which are dependent on the past, and it is strengthened and results in a further intensification of the sense of guilt. Since civilization obeys an internal erotic impulsion which causes human beings to unite in a closely knit group, it can only achieve this aim through an ever-increasing reinforcement of the sense of guilt. What began in relation to the father is completed in relation to the group. If civilization is a necessary course of development from the family to humanity as a whole, then, as a result of the inborn conflict arising from ambivalence of the eternal struggle between the trends of love and death, there is inextricably bound up with it an increase of the sense of guilt, which will perhaps reach heights that the individual finds hard to tolerate. One is reminded of the great poet's moving arraignment of the heavenly powers. Ihr führt ins Leben uns hinein, ihr lasst den Armen schuldig werden, dann überlasst ihn den Peien, denn jede Schuld ragt sich auf Erden. To earth, this weary earth, ye bring us, to guilt ye let us heedless go. Then leave repentance fierce to wring us, a moment's guilt, an age of woe. And we may well heave a sigh of relief at the thought that it is nevertheless vouchsafed to a few to salvage without effort from the whirlpool of their own feelings the deepest truths, towards which the rest of us have to find our way through tormenting uncertainty and with restless groping. 8. Having reached the end of his journey, the author must ask his readers' forgiveness for not having been a more skilful guide and for not having spared them empty stretches of road and troublesome détours. There is no doubt that it could have been done better. I will attempt, late in the day, to make some amends. In the first place, I suspect that the reader has the impression that our dissuasions on the sense of guilt disrupt the framework of this essay, that they take up too much space, so that the rest of its subject matter with which they are not always closely connected is pushed to one side. This may have spoilt the structure of my paper, but it corresponds faithfully to my intention to represent the sense of guilt as the most important problem in the development of civilization, and to show that the price we pay for our advance in civilization is a loss of happiness through the heightening of the sense of guilt. Anything that still sounds strange about this statement, which is the final conclusion of our investigation, can probably be traced to the quite peculiar relationship, as yet completely unexplained, which the sense of guilt has to our consciousness. In the common case of remorse, which we regard as normal, this feeling makes itself clearly enough perceptible to consciousness. Indeed, we are accustomed to speak of a consciousness of guilt instead of a sense of guilt. Our study of the neuroses, to which after all we owe the most valuable pointers to an understanding of normal conditions, brings us up against some contradictions. In one of those affections, obsessional neurosis, the sense of guilt makes itself noisily heard in consciousness. It dominates the clinical picture and the patient's life as well, and it hardly allows anything else to appear alongside of it. But in most other cases and forms of neurosis it remains completely unconscious, without, on that account, producing any less important effect. Our patients do not believe us when we attribute an unconscious sense of guilt to them. In order to make ourselves at all intelligible to them, we tell them of an unconscious need for punishment, in which the sense of guilt finds expression. But its connection with a particular form of neurosis must not be overestimated. Even in obsessional neurosis, there are types of patients who are not aware of their sense of guilt, or who only feel it as a tormenting uneasiness, a kind of anxiety, if they are prevented from carrying out certain actions. It ought to be possible eventually to understand these things, but as yet we cannot. Here perhaps we may be glad to have it pointed out that the sense of guilt is at bottom nothing else but a topographical variety of anxiety. In its later phases, it coincides completely with fear of the superego, and the relations of anxiety to consciousness exhibit the same extraordinary variations. Anxiety is always present somewhere or other behind every symptom, but at one time it takes noisy possession of the whole of consciousness, while at another it conceals itself so completely that we are obliged to speak of unconscious anxiety, or, if we want to have a clearer psychological conscience, since anxiety is in the first instance simply a feeling of possibilities, of anxiety. Consequently, it is very conceivable that the sense of guilt produced by civilization is not perceived as such either, and remains to a large extent unconscious, or appears as a sort of malaise, a dissatisfaction for which people seek other motivations. Religions, at any rate, have never overlooked the part played in civilization by a sense of guilt. Furthermore, a point which I failed to appreciate elsewhere, they claim to redeem mankind from this sense of guilt, which they call sin. From the manner in which, in Christianity, this redemption is achieved, by the sacrificial death of a single person who in this manner takes upon himself a guilt that is common to everyone, we have been able to infer what the first occasion may have been on which this primal guilt, which was also the beginning of civilization, was acquired. Though it cannot be of great importance, it may not be superfluous to elucidate the meaning of a few words such as superego, conscience, sense of guilt, need for punishment, and remorse, which we have often, perhaps, used too loosely and interchangeably. They all relate to the same state of affairs, but denote different aspects of it. The superego is an agency which has been inferred by us, and conscience is a function which we ascribe, among other functions, to that agency. This function consists in keeping a watch over the actions and intentions of the ego and judging them, in exercising a censorship. The sense of guilt, the harshness of the superego, is thus the same thing as the severity of the conscience. It is the perception which the ego has of being watched over in this way, the assessment of the tension between its own strivings and the demands of the superego. The fear of this critical agency, a fear which is at the bottom of the whole relationship, the need for punishment, is an instinctual manifestation on the part of the ego which has become masochistic under the influence of a sadistic superego. It is a portion, that is to say, of the instinct towards internal destruction present in the ego, employed for forming an erotic attachment to the superego. We ought not to speak of a conscience until a superego is demonstrably present. As to a sense of guilt, we must admit that it is in existence before the superego and therefore before conscience too. At that time it is the immediate expression of fear of the external authority, a recognition of the tension between the ego and that authority. It is the direct derivative of the conflict between the need for the authority's love and the urge towards instinctual satisfaction, whose inhibition produces the inclination to aggression. The superimposition of these two strata of the sense of guilt, one coming from fear of the external authority, the other from fear of the internal authority, has hampered our insight into the position of conscience in a number of ways. Remorse is a general term for the ego's reaction in a case of sense of guilt. It contains, in little altered form, the sensory material of the anxiety which is operating behind the sense of guilt. It is itself a punishment and can include the need for punishment. Thus, remorse too can be older than conscience. Nor will it do any harm if we once more review the contradictions which have for a while perplexed us during our inquiry. Thus, at one point the sense of guilt was the consequence of acts of aggression that had been abstained from. But at another point, and precisely at its historical beginning, the killing of the father, it was the consequence of an act of aggression that had been carried out. But a way out of this difficulty was found. For the institution of the internal authority, the superego, altered the situation radically. Before this, the sense of guilt coincided with remorse. We may remark incidentally that the term remorse should be reserved for the reaction after an act of aggression has actually been carried out. After this, owing to the omniscience of the superego, the difference between an aggression intended and an aggression carried out lost its force. Henceforward, a sense of guilt could be produced not only by an act of violence that is actually carried out, as all the world knows, but also by one that is merely intended, as psychoanalysis has discovered. Irrespectively of this alteration in the psychological situation, the conflict arising from ambivalence, the conflict between the two primal instincts, leaves the same result behind. We are tempted to look here for the solution of the problem of the varying relation in which the sense of guilt stands to consciousness. It might be thought that a sense of guilt arising from remorse for an evil deed must always be conscious, whereas a sense of guilt arising from the perception of an evil impulse may remain unconscious. But the answer is not so simple as that. Obsessional neurosis speaks energetically against it. The second contradiction concerned the aggressive energy with which we suppose the superego to be endowed. According to one view, that energy merely carries out the punitive energy of the external authority and keeps it alive in the mind, while, according to another view, it consists, on the contrary, of one's own aggressive energy which has not been used and which one now directs against that inhibiting authority. The first view seemed to fit in better with the history, and the second with the theory of the sense of guilt. Closer reflection has resolved this apparently irreconcilable contradiction almost too completely. What remained as the essential and common factor was that in each case we were dealing with an aggressiveness which had been displaced inwards. Clinical observation, moreover, allows us in fact to distinguish two sources for the aggressiveness which we attribute to the superego. One or the other of them exercises the stronger effect in any given case, but as a general rule, they operate in unison. This is, I think, the place at which to put forward for serious consideration a view which I have earlier recommended for provisional acceptance. In the most recent analytic literature, a predilection is shown for the idea that any kind of frustration, any thwarted instinctual satisfaction, results, or may result, in a heightening of the sense of guilt. A great theoretical simplification will, I think, be achieved if we regard this as applying only to the aggressive instincts, and little will be found to contradict this assumption. For how are we to account on dynamic and economic grounds for an increase in the sense of guilt appearing in place of an unfulfilled erotic demand? This only seems possible in a roundabout way, if we suppose, that is, that the prevention of an erotic satisfaction calls up a piece of aggressiveness against the person who has interfered with the satisfaction, and that this aggressiveness has itself to be suppressed in turn. But if this is so, it is after all only the aggressiveness which is transformed into a sense of guilt by being suppressed and made over to the superego. I am convinced that many processes will admit of a simpler and clearer exposition if the findings of psychoanalysis with regard to the derivation of the sense of guilt are restricted to the aggressive instincts. Examination of the clinical material gives us no unequivocal answer here, because, as our hypothesis tells us, the two classes of instinct hardly ever appear in a pure form, isolated from each other. But an investigation of extreme cases would probably point in the direction I anticipate. I am tempted to extract a first advantage from this more restricted view of the case by applying it to the process of repression. As we have learned, neurotic symptoms are in their essence substitutive satisfactions for unfulfilled sexual wishes. In the course of our analytic work, we have discovered to our surprise that perhaps every neurosis conceals a quota of unconscious sense of guilt, which in its turn fortifies the symptoms by making use of them as a punishment. It now seems plausible to formulate the following proposition. When an instinctual trend undergoes repression, its libidinal elements are turned into symptoms, and its aggressive components into a sense of guilt. Even if this proposition is only an average approximation to the truth, it is worthy of our interest. Some readers of this work may further have an impression that they have heard the formula of the struggle between eros and the death instinct too often. It was alleged to characterize the process of civilization which mankind undergoes, but it was also brought into connection with the development of the individual, and, in addition, it was said to have revealed the secret of organic life in general. We cannot, I think, avoid going into the relations of these three processes to one another. The repetition of the same formula is justified by the consideration that both the process of human civilization and of the development of the individual are also vital processes, which is to say that they must share in the most general characteristic of life. On the other hand, evidence of the presence of this general characteristic fails, for the very reason of its general nature, to help us to arrive at any differentiation between the processes, so long as it is not narrowed down by special qualifications. We can only be satisfied, therefore, if we assert that the process of civilization is a modification which the vital process experiences under the influence of a task that is set it by eros, and instigated by ananke, by the exigencies of reality, and that this task is one of uniting separate individuals into a community bound together by libidinal ties. When, however, we look at the relation between the process of human civilization and the developmental or educative process of individual human beings, we shall conclude without much hesitation that the two are very similar in nature, if not the very same process applied to different kinds of object. The process of the civilization of the human species is, of course, an abstraction of a higher order than is the development of the individual, and it is therefore harder to apprehend in concrete terms. Nor should we pursue analogies to an obsessional extreme. But in view of the similarity between the aims of the two processes, in the one case the integration of a separate individual into a human group, and in the other case the creation of a unified group out of many individuals, we cannot be surprised at the similarity between the means employed and the resultant phenomena. In view of its exceptional importance, we must not long postpone the mention of one feature which distinguishes between the two processes. In the developmental process of the individual, the program of the pleasure principle, which consists in finding the satisfaction of happiness, is retained as the main aim. Integration in or adaptation to a human community appears as a scarcely avoidable condition which must be fulfilled before this aim of happiness can be achieved. If it could be done without that condition, it would perhaps be preferable. To put it in other words, the development of the individual seems to us to be a product of the interaction between two urges: the urge towards happiness, which we usually call egoistic, and the urge towards union with others in the community, which we call altruistic. Neither of these descriptions goes much below the surface. In the process of individual development, as we have said, the main accent falls mostly on the egoistic urge, or the urge towards happiness, while the other urge, which may be described as a cultural one, is usually content with the role of imposing restrictions. But in the process of civilization, things are different. Here by far the most important thing is the aim of creating a unity out of the individual human beings. It is true that the aim of happiness is still there, but it is pushed into the background. It almost seems as if the creation of a great human community would be most successful if no attention had to be paid to the happiness of the individual. The developmental process of the individual can thus be expected to have special features of its own, which are not reproduced in the process of human civilization. It is only insofar as the first of these processes has union with the community as its aim that it need coincide with the second process. Just as a planet revolves around a central body as well as rotating on its own axis, so the human individual takes part in the course of development of mankind at the same time as he pursues his own path in life. But to our dull eyes, the play of forces in the heavens seems fixed in an ever-changing order. In the field of organic life, we can still see how the forces contend with one another and how the effects of the conflict are continually changing. So also the two urges, the one towards personal happiness and the other towards union with other human beings, must struggle with each other in every individual. And so also the two processes of individual and of cultural development must stand in hostile opposition to each other and mutually dispute the ground. But this struggle between the individual and society is not a derivative of the contradiction, probably an irreconcilable one, between the primal instincts of eros and death. It is a dispute within the economics of the libido, comparable to the contest concerning the distribution of libido between ego and objects. And it does admit of an eventual accommodation in the individual, as, it may be hoped, it will also do in the future of civilization, however much that civilization may oppress the life of the individual today. The analogy between the process of civilization and the path of individual development may be extended in an important respect. It can be asserted that the community too evolves a superego, under whose influence cultural development proceeds. It would be a tempting task for anyone who has a knowledge of human civilizations to follow out this analogy in detail. I will confine myself to bringing forward a few striking points. The superego of an epoch of civilization has an origin similar to that of an individual. It is based on the impression left behind by the personalities of great leaders, men of overwhelming force of mind, or men in whom one of the human impulsions has found its strongest and purest, and therefore often its most one-sided, expression. In many instances, the analogy goes still further, in that during their lifetime these figures were, often enough, even if not always, mocked and maltreated by others, and even dispatched in a cruel fashion. In the same way, indeed, the primal father did not attain divinity until long after he had met his death by violence. The most arresting example of this fateful conjunction is to be seen in the figure of Jesus Christ, if indeed that figure is not a part of mythology which called it into being from an obscure memory of that primal event. Another point of agreement between the cultural and the individual superego is that the former, just like the latter, sets up strict ideal demands, disobedience to which is visited with fear of conscience. Here indeed we come across the remarkable circumstance that the mental processes concerned are actually more familiar to us and more accessible to consciousness as they are seen in the group than they can be in the individual man. In him, when tension arises, it is only the aggressiveness of the superego which, in the form of reproaches, makes itself noisily heard. Its actual demands often remain unconscious in the background. If we bring them to conscious knowledge, we find that they coincide with the precepts of the prevailing cultural superego. At this point, the two processes, that of the cultural development of the group and that of the cultural development of the individual, are, as it were, always interlocked. For that reason, some of the manifestations and properties of the superego can be more easily detected in its behavior in the cultural community than in the separate individual. The cultural superego has developed its ideals and set up its demands. Among the latter, those which deal with the relations of human beings to one another are comprised under the heading of ethics. People have at all times set the greatest value on ethics, as though they expected that it in particular would produce especially important results. And it does in fact deal with the subject which can easily be recognized as the sorest spot in every civilization. Ethics is thus to be regarded as a therapeutic attempt, as an endeavor to achieve by means of a command of the superego something which has so far not been achieved by means of any other cultural activities. As we already know, the problem before us is how to get rid of the greatest hindrance to civilization, namely, the constitutional inclination of human beings to be aggressive towards one another. And for that very reason we are especially interested in what is probably the most recent of the cultural commands of the superego, the commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself. In our research into and therapy of a neurosis, we are led to make two reproaches against the superego of the individual. In the severity of its commands and prohibitions, it troubles itself too little about the happiness of the ego, in that it takes insufficient account of the resistances against obeying them, of the instinctual strength of the id, in the first place, and of the difficulties presented by the real external environment, in the second. Consequently, we are very often obliged, for therapeutic purposes, to oppose the superego, and we endeavor to lower its demands. Exactly the same objections can be made against the ethical demands of the cultural superego. It, too, does not trouble itself enough about the facts of the mental constitution of human beings. It issues a command, and does not ask whether it is possible for people to obey it. On the contrary, it assumes that a man's ego is psychologically capable of anything that is required of it, that his ego has unlimited mastery over his id. This is a mistake. And even in what are known as normal people, the id cannot be controlled beyond certain limits. If more is demanded of a man, a revolt will be produced in him, or a neurosis, or he will be made unhappy. The commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself, is the strongest defense against human aggressiveness and an excellent example of the psychological proceedings of the cultural superego. The commandment is impossible to fulfill. Such an enormous inflation of love can only lower its value, not get rid of the difficulty. Civilization pays no attention to all this. It merely admonishes us that the harder it is to obey the precept, the more meritorious it is to do so. But anyone who follows such a precept in present-day civilization only puts himself at a disadvantage vis-à-vis the person who disregards it. What a potent obstacle to civilization aggressiveness must be if the defense against it can cause as much unhappiness as aggressiveness itself. Natural ethics, as it is called, has nothing to offer here except the narcissistic satisfaction of being able to think oneself better than others. At this point, the ethics based on religion introduces its promises of a better afterlife. But so long as virtue is not rewarded here on earth, ethics will, I fancy, preach in vain. I too think it quite certain that a real change in the relations of human beings to possessions would be of more help in this direction than any ethical commands. But the recognition of this fact among socialists has been obscured and made useless for practical purposes by a fresh, idealistic misconception of human nature. I believe the line of thought which seeks to trace in the phenomena of cultural development the part played by a superego promises still further discoveries. I hasten to come to a close. But there is one question which I can hardly evade. If the development of civilization has such a far-reaching similarity to the development of the individual, and if it employs the same methods, may we not be justified in reaching the diagnosis that, under the influence of cultural urges, some civilizations or some epochs of civilization, possibly the whole of mankind, have become neurotic? An analytic dissection of such neuroses might lead to therapeutic recommendations which could lay claim to great practical interest. I would not say that an attempt of this kind to carry psychoanalysis over to the cultural community was absurd or doomed to be fruitless. But we should have to be very cautious and not forget that, after all, we are only dealing with analogies, and that it is dangerous, not only with men but also with concepts, to tear them from the sphere in which they have originated and been evolved. Moreover, the diagnosis of communal neuroses is faced with a special difficulty. In an individual neurosis, we take as our starting point the contrast that distinguishes the patient from his environment, which is assumed to be normal. For a group, all of whose members are affected by one and the same disorder, no such background could exist. It would have to be found elsewhere. And as regards the therapeutic application of our knowledge, what would be the use of the most correct analysis of social neuroses, since no one paroles authority to impose such a therapy upon the group? But in spite of all these difficulties, we may expect that one day someone will venture to embark upon a pathology of cultural communities. For a wide variety of reasons, it is very far from my intention to express an opinion upon the value of human civilization. I have endeavored to guard myself against the enthusiastic prejudice which holds that our civilization is the most precious thing that we possess or could acquire, and that its path will necessarily lead to heights of unimagined perfection. I can at least listen without indignation to the critic who is of the opinion that when one surveys the aims of cultural endeavour and the means it employs, one is bound to come to the conclusion that the whole effort is not worth the trouble, and that the outcome of it can only be a state of affairs which the individual will be unable to tolerate. My impartiality is made all the easier to me by my knowing very little about all these things. One thing only do I know for certain, and that is that man's judgments of value follow directly his wishes for happiness, that, accordingly, they are an attempt to support his illusions with arguments. I should find it very understandable if someone were to point out the obligatory nature of the course of human civilization, and were to say, for instance, that the tendencies to a restriction of sexual life or to the institution of a humanitarian ideal at the expense of natural selection were developmental trends which cannot be averted or turned aside, and to which it is best for us to yield as though they were necessities of nature. I know, too, the objection that can be made against this, to the effect that in the history of mankind, trends such as these, which were considered unsurmountable, have often been thrown aside and replaced by other trends. Thus I have not the courage to rise up before my fellow men as a prophet, and I bow to their reproach that I can offer them no consolation. For at bottom, that is what they are all demanding. The wildest revolutionaries no less passionately than the most virtuous believers. The fateful question for the human species seems to me to be whether and to what extent their cultural development will succeed in mastering the disturbance of their communal life by the human instinct of aggression and self-destruction. It may be that in this respect precisely the present time deserves a special interest. Men have gained control over the forces of nature to such an extent that with their help they would have no difficulty in exterminating one another to the last man. They know this, and hence comes a large part of their current unrest, their unhappiness, and their mood of anxiety. And now it is to be expected that the other of the two heavenly powers, eternal Eros, will make an effort to assert himself in the struggle with his equally immortal adversary. But who can foresee with what success and with what result? This concludes Civilization and Its Discontents. Please visit our website, www.tantor.com, for more information on our growing library of unabridged audiobooks and to take advantage of special offers. Or call toll-free 877-7-TANTOR to request a catalogue.